In the mists of time, where memory dissolves into legend, and legend breathes with the whisper of wind through ancient pines, there lived a woman whose very name meant daughter of the sun. Across islands, wrapped in morning fog, where the boundary between the mortal realm and the spirit world grew thin as silk, her voice carried the weight of prophecy and the gentle authority of one who spoke with gods. She dwelt where shadows danced with light, where the rustle of hemp robes mingled with the distant call of cranes, and where 1,000 women moved like prayers made manifest through halls that knew no footfall of men. In fortresses crowned with wooden towers reaching toward heaven, in chambers lit by bronze mirrors that captured not just light, but souls. She ruled not with sword or iron, but with the ancient magic that flows between heartbeats, between breaths, between the seen and unseen worlds. This is the story of Himiko, whose reign bloomed like sakura in the eternal spring of mystery, whose legacy whispers still through the corridors of time. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, when the great Han dynasty had crumbled into the warring kingdoms of Wei, Wu, and Shu, and Rome stretched its marble fingers across distant continents, there lay beyond the eastern edge of the known world a chain of islands that the Chinese called Wa. These were the Japanese islands, wrapped in perpetual mist and mystery, where the sun was born each morning from the embrace of the endless ocean. The islands themselves were a realm of contrasts, where gentle valleys cradled by volcanic peaks gave way to rugged coastlines battered by the eternal conversation between wind and wave. Primeval forests of cedar and cryptomeria climbed the mountain slopes like prayers ascending to heaven, their ancient trunks bearing witness to millennia of seasons. In the lowlands, rivers carved silver paths through emerald rice paddies, there, waters reflecting clouds that drifted like the souls of ancestors across azure skies. This was a land where the boundary between the natural and supernatural remained gossamer thin, where every mountain held a spirit, every stream sang with the voice of a kami, and every stone along the path might harbor the essence of something greater than mortal understanding. The people who inhabited these sacred islands lived not merely upon the land, but within it, their lives intertwined with the rhythm of seasons, the whisper of wind through bamboo groves, and the eternal dance of sun and moon across the vault of heaven. The inhabitants of Wa in this distant time were a people caught between worlds, inheritors of an ancient hunting and gathering tradition that had flourished for thousands of years, yet newly awakened to the possibilities of agriculture, metallurgy, and the complex social structures that such innovations inevitably brought. They were the descendants of the Jomon, those mysterious artisans who had created some of the world's earliest pottery, their vessels adorned with rope-like patterns that seemed to capture the very essence of nature's endless creativity. But by the time our story begins, the old ways were giving way to new ones. The Yayoi culture had taken root, bringing with it the cultivation of rice in flooded fields, the forging of bronze and iron tools, and the gradual emergence of social hierarchies that would reshape the islands forever. Villages grew larger and more permanent, their thatched roof houses raised on stilts above the fertile earth, while moats and palisades spoke of a new age where conflict and cooperation existed in delicate balance. Across these 100 islands, scattered like pearls upon the dark silk of the sea, numerous kingdoms had emerged. Each ruled its own domain, each with its own traditions, its own gods, its own ways of reading the intentions of heaven in the flight of birds and the patterns of clouds. Some were maritime peoples, their painted boats carrying them across the treacherous straits that separated island from island, their lives governed by the rhythm of tides and the mercy of storms. Others dwelt inland, their prosperity built upon the bounty of rice fields and the skill of craftsmen who could transform clay into vessels of exquisite beauty, hemp into cloth of remarkable durability, and raw metal into tools and weapons that gleamed like captured starlight. Among these many kingdoms, alliances shifted like weather patterns, forming and dissolving with the passage of seasons. trade flowed along well-established routes, carrying not only goods, but ideas, technologies, and stories that would weave themselves into the growing tapestry of island culture. Salt from the coastal regions found its way to mountain villages, while iron tools crafted in inland forges traveled to fishing communities where they were traded for pearls and dried fish that had been hauled from the depths of the surrounding seas. Yet beneath this apparent prosperity lay currents of tension that ran as deep as the ocean trenches surrounding the islands. The introduction of rice agriculture had brought abundance, but it had also created the possibility of surplus, and with surplus came inequality. Some families grew wealthy while others struggled. Some villages expanded their territories while others found themselves pressed between competing claims. The bronze and iron tools that made life easier also made warfare more deadly, and the social structures that enabled complex societies also created opportunities for exploitation and oppression. It was into this world of beauty and complexity, of ancient traditions and emerging possibilities, that the girl who would become known as Himiko was born. The exact year of her birth remains lost in the mists of time, but scholars place it somewhere around the year 170 of the Common Era, during the height of the Yayoi period, when the cultural transformations that would define classical Japan were still taking shape. The Chinese chronicles that would later record Himiko's reign spoke of a period of chaos that preceded her rise to power, a time when the islands of Wa were consumed by warfare and strife for 70 or 80 years. This was an era that the islanders themselves remembered as the time of troubled waters, when the natural harmony that should exist between heaven, earth, and humanity seemed to have been shattered like a precious bronze mirror dropped upon stone. The troubles had begun gradually, almost imperceptibly, like the first tremors that precede a great earthquake. What had once been a loose confederation of kingdoms, united by shared cultural practices and common reverence for the spirits of land and sea, began to fragment into rival factions. The abundance brought by rice cultivation had created not only wealth, but also the desire for more wealth, and the tools that made agriculture possible could just as easily be turned to the purposes of war. Villages that had once traded freely with their neighbors began to view them with suspicion. Boundaries that had existed more as suggestions than as absolute barriers became fortified lines, defended by warriors armed with iron spears and bronze swords. The waterways that had once carried merchants and pilgrims now bore war canoes filled with fighters painted for battle, their faces marked with symbols that spoke of clan loyalties and ancient grievances. In this time of discord, the spiritual equilibrium of the islands was also disturbed. The kami, those divine spirits that dwelt within every aspect of the natural world, seemed to withdraw their blessings. Harvests failed more frequently, storms arose with unusual violence, and the omens read by the shamans and priestesses spoke of divine displeasure with the actions of mortals. The people began to question whether their leaders possessed the spiritual authority necessary to maintain the cosmic harmony upon which all prosperity depended. Traditional forms of governance, which had relied upon consensus and the wisdom of elders, proved inadequate to address the complex challenges of this new age. Village headmen who had been skilled at mediating disputes over fishing rights found themselves overwhelmed by conflicts involving territorial claims spanning multiple settlements. Clan leaders who had earned respect through their ability to ensure good harvests discovered that military skill was now equally important, if not more so, than spiritual insight. The very foundations of society seemed to be shifting like sand beneath a rising tide. The extended family networks that had formed the basic structure of island society began to give way to larger political entities based upon alliance and conquest rather than blood relationship. Warriors, once merely one occupation among many, began to emerge as a distinct social class with their own codes of conduct and their own claims to authority. The careful balance between material and spiritual concerns that had characterized the older culture threatened to tip decisively toward the pursuit of worldly power. Yet it was precisely during this period of apparent breakdown that the seeds of a new form of leadership began to germinate. The very chaos that threatened to tear the islands apart also created an opportunity for someone with extraordinary gifts to step forward and offer a different vision of how society might be organized. The people's desperate need for stability and their hunger for spiritual guidance created conditions in which a leader who could combine political acumen with shamanic authority might command unprecedented loyalty and respect. Across the islands, stories began to circulate of a young woman whose spiritual powers surpassed those of any shaman or priestess in living memory. She was said to be able to communicate directly with the kami, to receive visions of events happening in distant places, and to predict the outcome of battles before they were fought. More importantly, she was rumored to possess the ability to restore the harmony between the human and spirit worlds that had been so grievously damaged by decades of warfare and strife. The tales that reached the courts of various kingdom rulers spoke of miraculous healings, of droughts ended by her prayers, and of conflicts resolved through her mediation. Some dismissed these stories as mere folklore, the kind of wishful thinking that always arose during times of hardship. Others, however, began to wonder whether the gods themselves might be preparing to intervene in human affairs through the agency of this mysterious young woman. As the conflicts continued to ravage the islands, leaving villages burned and families scattered, the need for a unifying force became increasingly apparent to thoughtful observers. The old ways of governance had proven inadequate to the challenges of the new age, yet none of the emerging military leaders had succeeded in establishing lasting peace. What was needed was someone who could command respect not merely through force of arms, but through spiritual authority that transcended the narrow interests of any single clan or kingdom. It was during this period of deepening crisis and growing anticipation that the future, Queen Himiko, began her journey from obscure village girl to the most powerful ruler in the island's history. Her transformation would not happen overnight, nor would it occur without struggle and sacrifice. But the foundations for her eventual rise were being laid during these dark years, as the island's inhabitants learned through bitter experience that neither military might alone nor traditional authority was sufficient to restore the peace and prosperity they desperately craved. In the mountainous region that would later be known as part of the Great Yamatai Confederation, where morning mist clung to cedar slopes and clear streams descended through terraced valleys toward the distant sea, a child was born who would reshape the destiny of the islands. Her birth was attended by portents that the local shamans would remember and recount for generations to come. A great red sun that rose without clouds to obscure its face, the cry of a crane that echoed 3 times across the valley, and the unusual behavior of the village's sacred mirror, which seemed to glow with its own inner light throughout the night preceding her arrival. The child's parents named her with characters that meant sun child or daughter of the sun, though the exact pronunciation of her name would be rendered differently by various chroniclers in the years to come. To the Chinese who would later write of her, she would be known as Himiko, but to her own people, she may have been called by variations that emphasize different aspects of her divine connection to Amaterasu, the great sun goddess who was regarded as the ancestral mother of all legitimate rulers in the islands. From her earliest years, it was apparent that this child was marked by unusual gifts. She seemed to perceive things that remained hidden from others, often speaking of visitors before they appeared on the mountain path or warning of storms while the sky remained clear. The village shamans, wise women who had spent decades learning to read the intentions of the kami in the patterns of nature, recognized in the young Himiko a natural sensitivity to the spirit world that surpassed their own carefully cultivated abilities. As she grew from child to young woman, Himiko's reputation spread beyond her mountain village to the settlements scattered throughout the valley and beyond. People began to make pilgrimages to seek her counsel, bringing offerings of rice and silk to lay before the simple altar that her family maintained in their home. She would receive these visitors in a manner that struck all who met her as both utterly natural and profoundly otherworldly, speaking in a voice that seemed to carry echoes of wind through ancient trees and the distant sound of temple bells. Her prophecies, delivered in states that resembled deep meditation or trance, proved Remarkably accurate, she predicted the outcomes of harvest seasons, the success or failure of trading expeditions, and the results of conflicts between neighboring villages. More remarkably still, her counsel seemed invariably to lead toward reconciliation rather than continued strife. Villages that had been locked in bitter disputes found themselves able to reach agreements after consulting with the young oracle, while clans that had maintained blood feuds for generations discovered paths toward peace through her mediation. It was during this period of growing recognition that Himiko began to develop the practices and rituals that would later characterize her reign as queen. She established a routine of daily communion with the spirits, rising before dawn to greet the sun from a sacred grove high on the mountainside, where ancient trees formed a natural temple open to the sky. There, surrounded by offerings of flowers and incense, she would enter into the meditative states that allowed her to receive visions and guidance from the realm beyond ordinary perception. The young woman also began to gather around herself a community of female attendants and disciples, women who had been called by dreams or visions to serve the emerging spiritual leader. These women, drawn from villages throughout the region, brought with them knowledge of local customs, expertise in various crafts, and their own spiritual gifts that complemented and amplified Himiko's abilities. Together, they formed the nucleus of what would eventually become the elaborate court that would surround the future queen. As political conditions throughout the islands continued to deteriorate, with warfare spreading and traditional authorities proving increasingly ineffective, delegations began to arrive at Himiko's mountain retreat with requests that went far beyond personal consultation or village mediation. Representatives from entire kingdoms sought her blessing for their rulers, her predictions regarding the outcomes of major conflicts, and her guidance in matters that affected the lives of thousands of people. It was during one such consultation, according to later accounts, that Himiko received the vision that would transform her from a respected local oracle into a political leader of unprecedented authority. In a trance that lasted for 3 days and 3 nights, during which she neither ate nor drank nor spoke to any mortal being, she experienced a revelation from Amaterasu herself. The sun goddess, speaking through symbols and images that only gradually became clear to the young woman, revealed that the time had come for the islands to be united under a single ruler who could serve as the earthly representative of divine will. When Himiko emerged from this extended vision, she spoke for the first time not as a humble village girl offering counsel to those who sought her aid, but as one who had been chosen by the gods themselves to fulfill a destiny of cosmic significance. Her words, delivered to the assembled delegations, and recorded by scribes who were present, marked the beginning of her transformation from spiritual guide to political sovereign. She announced that the kami had grown weary of the endless conflicts that plagued the islands, and that divine intervention would now manifest through human agency to restore the harmony that should exist between heaven and earth. The response to this announcement was immediate and profound. Some of those present fell to their knees in recognition of the divine authority that seemed to radiate from the young woman like light from a sacred flame. Others departed swiftly to carry word of what they had witnessed back to their respective kingdoms, where the news would be received with mixtures of hope, skepticism, and political calculation. Still others remained at the mountain retreat, understanding that they were witnessing the birth of a new age and desiring to be part of whatever transformation was about to unfold. In the months that followed this pivotal moment, Himiko began the careful process of translating spiritual authority into political power. She did not seek to conquer territories through military force, as so many aspiring rulers had attempted, but rather to demonstrate through her actions and the obvious blessing of the gods that she possessed the legitimacy necessary to command voluntary allegiance. Villages and kingdoms that acknowledged her authority found their internal conflicts resolved, their harvests improved, and their relations with neighbors stabilized in ways that seemed to confirm the divine source of her power. As autumn painted, the mountain slopes in shades of crimson and gold, and the first frost touched the valleys where rice waited for harvest, Himiko established the patterns of rule that would define her extraordinary reign. Unlike the warrior kings who sought to impose their will through conquest and intimidation, she governed through a form of spiritual authority that seemed to flow directly from the realm of the kami into the world of mortal concerns. Her court, if it could be called such, bore little resemblance to the traditional centers of power that had emerged in other parts of the islands. Rather than a fortress built for defense against enemies, Himiko chose to establish her primary residence in a complex of wooden buildings that seemed to grow organically from the sacred grove where she had first received her great vision. The structures, built without nails in the ancient manner, used interlocking beams and posts that created spaces both intimate and grand, where the boundary between interior and exterior remained deliberately fluid. The most striking aspect of this unusual court was its composition, where other rulers surrounded themselves with male advisors, military commanders, and hereditary nobles. Himiko gathered around herself a community of nearly 1,000 women. These were not merely servants or decorative presences, but skilled practitioners of various arts essential to governance in an age when spiritual and temporal authority remained inseparably intertwined. Among them were shamans and priestesses from throughout the islands, women whose abilities to communicate with the spirit world complemented and amplified Himiko's own gifts. There were also master craftswomen who could weave silk of extraordinary fineness, create pottery that captured the essence of natural forms, and work with bronze and iron to produce implements and ornaments of remarkable beauty. Scholars versed in the Chinese writing system maintained correspondence with distant kingdoms and preserved the growing body of law that surrounded the queen's reign. Herbalists and healers tended to the physical needs of the community while also preparing the special incenses and offerings that facilitated communion with the kami. The daily rhythm of life in this unique community revolved around the cycles of spiritual observance that Himiko had established. Each dawn found the queen and her attendants gathered in the sacred grove, where they greeted the rising sun with prayers and offerings that honored Amaterasu and sought guidance for the day ahead. These morning ceremonies were followed by periods of consultation, during which delegations from various kingdoms would present their concerns and requests for the queen's intercession or advice. Himiko would receive these visitors while seated upon a simple wooden throne carved from a single piece of ancient cedar, its surface polished to a silken smoothness by countless hands over unknown years. She was typically clothed in robes of the finest silk, dyed in shades that echoed the colors of sky and forest, and adorned with ornaments of bronze and jade that caught and reflected the light in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Most remarkable of all were the bronze mirrors that formed part of her regalia, surfaces so perfectly polished that they seemed to hold not merely reflections, but glimpses of otherworldly realms. The Queen's manner of governance was unlike anything previously seen in the islands. Rather than issuing decrees or commanding obedience through displays of force, she would listen carefully to the problems presented to her, then enter into a meditative state that allowed her to perceive the underlying spiritual causes of whatever difficulties had arisen. Her responses, when they came, often took the form of seemingly simple suggestions that addressed not merely the immediate symptoms of a problem, but its deeper roots in the relationship between human communities and the divine order that governed all existence. Drought that threatened the rice harvest in a distant valley might be traced to the neglect of proper rituals honoring the water kami, leading to recommendations for ceremonies that would restore the spiritual balance necessary for abundant rainfall. A conflict between neighboring villages over fishing rights might be resolved through the establishment of new festivals that honored the sea spirits while also creating opportunities for the communities to interact peacefully and profitably. A series of mysterious illnesses affecting the children of a particular clan might be addressed through purification rituals that cleansed not only the physical environment, but also the spiritual contamination that had accumulated over generations of improper conduct. These solutions, invariably effective in ways that seemed to confirm their divine inspiration, gradually built Himiko's reputation as a ruler whose authority transcended ordinary political categories. She was not merely a military commander who could enforce her will through violence, nor simply a hereditary noble whose bloodline conferred legitimacy. Instead, she represented something new in the political landscape of the islands, a sovereign whose power derived directly from her ability to serve as an intermediary between the human and divine realms, ensuring that the actions of mortal rulers remained in harmony with the intentions of the gods. As word of these remarkable achievements spread throughout the islands, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and diplomatic envoys, increasing numbers of kingdoms began to acknowledge Himiko's authority. This was not the forced submission that followed military conquest, but rather a voluntary recognition that here was a form of leadership capable of addressing the spiritual crisis that underlay the political chaos of the age. Villages that had been devastated by warfare found peace under her protection, while regions that had suffered from natural disasters experienced renewed prosperity after accepting her guidance. The Queen's influence extended far beyond the immediate resolution of specific problems. Under her leadership, a new synthesis began to emerge between the various cultural traditions that had developed across the islands during the preceding centuries. The rice-growing techniques of the Yayoi period were integrated with the spiritual practices inherited from the Jomon tradition, while the metalworking skills learned from contact with the Asian mainland were used to create ritual objects that served both practical and ceremonial purposes. Chinese writing, previously known only to a few scholars, began to be adapted for recording the increasingly complex administrative needs of the expanding confederation. Perhaps most importantly, Himiko's reign marked the beginning of a new understanding of rulership itself. Where previous leaders had been viewed primarily as successful warriors, skilled negotiators, or fortunate inheritors of ancestral authority, she demonstrated that true sovereignty required the ability to maintain harmony between the visible world of human activity and the invisible realm of spiritual forces that ultimately determined the fate of all earthly endeavors. This integration of temporal and sacred authority would become a defining characteristic of Japanese imperial ideology for centuries to come, establishing precedents that would influence the development of the nation's political culture long after Himiko herself had passed into legend. As the seasons turned and her influence continued to expand across the islands, the woman who had begun as a village oracle found herself presiding over a transformation that encompassed not merely political structures but the very conception of how divine will might manifest through human institutions. The sacred grove where she held court had become the spiritual center of a new form of civilization, one that sought to embody the harmony between heaven and earth that had been the goal of island culture since time immemorial, but which had never before been achieved on such a scale or with such apparent divine blessing. The bronze mirrors that adorned her throne reflected not only light, but the growing confidence of a people who had found in their extraordinary queen a leader capable of bridging the gap between the world they could see and the world they could only sense through the movements of wind and the changing patterns of clouds across the eternal sky. As the first year of her formal rule drew to a close, marked by festivals that celebrated both the harvest and the restoration of peace, it was becoming clear that Himiko's reign would be remembered not merely as another chapter in the political history of the islands, but as the dawn of a new age in which the divine and human realms had achieved an unprecedented degree of harmony. In the sacred grove where ancient cedars touched the clouds, Himiko stood before the altar of polished bronze mirrors, their surfaces reflecting not her earthly form, but the shimmer of spirits that danced between worlds. The morning mist clung to her silk robes like the breath of ancestors, and in her hands, the sacred bells sang their silver song to the awakening dawn. This was the hour when the veil between realms grew thin, when the Sun Daughter could speak with voices older than memory itself. The confederated chiefs of 30 kingdoms waited in reverent silence beyond the ceremonial screens, their heads bowed as her voice rose in the ancient chants that had guided their people since the first rice shoots pushed through sacred soil. They had come from villages scattered across mountains and valleys, from coastal settlements where fishing boats bobbed like prayers on morning waves, from inland communities where bronze bells marked the passage of seasons. All had sworn fealty to the woman who could read the will of Amaterasu in the flight of cranes and the whisper of bamboo leaves. In the fortress that crowned the sacred mountain, 1,000 women moved like shadows through corridors adorned with silk tapestries and lacquered screens, depicting the eternal dance of cherry blossoms. These were her attendants, chosen not merely for their grace, but for their ability to perceive the subtle currents of spiritual energy that flowed through the physical world. Some were skilled in the preparation of sacred rice wine that could induce visions, others in the careful arrangement of mirror sequences that could divine the future, and still others in the ancient art of calling rain from cloudless skies. Among them moved Toyō, her young successor, watching with eyes that held the wisdom of old souls. The girl possessed the same gift that had marked Himiko as chosen by the gods, the ability to enter the trance state where human consciousness dissolved into the greater web of existence. But where Himiko's power burned like summer lightning, brilliant and commanding, Toyo's gift flowed like moonlight on still water, gentle yet profound. The queen had recognized in this child the continuation of the divine lineage, the assurance that the sacred traditions would endure beyond her earthly reign. The rituals that governed daily life in Yamatai followed rhythms as old as the tide. At dawn, incense rose from hundreds of household shrines, carrying the prayers of farmers seeking favorable weather, of fishermen requesting safe passage, of mothers hoping for healthy children. The smoke spiraled upward through morning air already, thick with the scent of cherry blossoms and the distant salt tang of the sea. In villages throughout the Confederation, bronze bells chimed in unison with those that rang from Himiko's mountain fortress, creating a symphony of devotion that unified disparate tribes under one sacred purpose. The merchants who traveled the trade routes between kingdoms spoke in hushed voices of the miracles they had witnessed. Stories spread like ripples across the archipelago of droughts ended by the queen's intervention, of storms calmed by her sacred dances, of enemies who laid down their arms after receiving visions of defeat in her bronze mirrors. Whether these tales grew in the telling mattered less than the faith they inspired, for belief itself had become a form of currency in the realm where spiritual and temporal power flowed as one river. In the workshops that surrounded the royal compound, artisans shaped clay into vessels that would hold not merely grain or water, but the essence of prayers offered at their creation. The pottery of Himiko's reign bore distinctive marks, spiral patterns that echoed the sacred dances, wave motifs that honored the sea spirits, and stylized images of birds that carried messages between earth and sky. These vessels traveled far beyond Yamatai's borders, bearing with them the aesthetic signature of a civilization that saw no separation between the practical and the divine. The queen's daily life unfolded according to patterns as precise as the movements of celestial bodies. She rose before dawn to perform the water purification ritual, her bare feet touching the smooth stones of the mountain stream that flowed beneath her fortress. The cold water that washed over her skin carried away the accumulated spiritual impurities of the previous day, preparing her to serve as a clean vessel for the divine communications that would guide her people's fate. After purification came the morning divination, performed in a chamber where bronze mirrors had been arranged according to the sacred geometry that reflected the structure of the cosmos. The morning light, filtering through carefully positioned openings in the chamber walls, would strike the mirrors at specific angles, creating patterns of reflected radiance that the queen interpreted as messages from the sun goddess. The position of each reflection, the intensity of each gleam, the way shadows fell between points of light, all carried meaning for those trained to read the language of illumination. These morning sessions determined not only the spiritual weather of the coming day, but practical decisions that affected thousands of lives. Which villages should plant their rice first, when the fishing fleets should set sail, where new settlements might be established, which diplomatic missions should be launched, all flowed from the patterns of light that danced across the ritual mirrors. The queen's attendants recorded these divine communications in carefully maintained chronicles, creating a record that served both as historical document and guide for future generations. Across the wine-dark waters that separated the island realm from the great continent, news had reached the court of Wei that a powerful queen ruled in the eastern lands where the sun was born each morning. The Chinese chronicles spoke of a confederation of kingdoms united under the authority of a woman who communed with spirits and commanded the loyalty of 30 tribal chiefs through the power of her sacred visions. Such reports had reached the ears of emperors before, but something in the consistency of these accounts, the details of organized governance and sophisticated ritual practices, suggested that this Himiko was no mere local chieftain elevated by superstition. In the year that Chinese scribes recorded as 238 CE, the wind-blown ships of Yamatai's first official embassy appeared on the horizon like prayers made manifest. The vessels that carried Himiko's envoys across the treacherous straits bore the artistic mark of a civilization that understood the marriage of function and beauty. Their hulls curved with the grace of seabirds, their sails painted with symbols that spoke of sun and storm and the eternal wheel of seasons. The diplomatic mission had been months in preparation, for the Queen understood that first impressions would shape the relationship between her island confederation and the vast continental empire for generations to come. Nashonmi, the chief ambassador, chosen to represent Yamatai's interests, carried with him gifts that spoke eloquently of his homeland's sophistication. Bolts of silk that shimmered with the captured essence of morning dew, pottery glazed with techniques unknown to continental artisans, bronze mirrors polished to perfection and inscribed with sacred symbols, and pearls that held the condensed moonlight of countless nights. These treasures were arranged in lacquered boxes according to ritual protocols that transformed mere objects into vessels of diplomatic meaning. The journey itself had been an act of faith, for the spring seas between the islands and the mainland were notorious for their sudden storms and treacherous currents, but Himiko's shamanic powers had been invoked to ensure safe passage, and her priests had performed the necessary rituals to win the favor of the sea spirits. The bronze bells that hung from the ship's prows sang their protective songs across the waves, while specially trained maritime shamans maintained constant vigil against the supernatural dangers that lurked beneath the surface of deep waters. When the Yamatai embassy finally appeared before the Chinese border officials, their presence created a sensation that rippled through the administrative hierarchy. These were not the rough barbarians that continental prejudice might have expected, but representatives of a sophisticated court who conducted themselves with a dignity that commanded respect. Their leader spoke Chinese with an accent that marked him as educated in the classical traditions, and the gifts they presented demonstrated a level of artistic achievement that surprised even jaded imperial functionaries. The formal presentation at the Wei capital unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of diplomatic protocol. Nashonmi and his companions prostrated themselves before the dragon throne according to the ancient formulas, but their movements carried a grace that spoke of equal dignity rather than mere submission. When they rose to present their queen's greetings, the silk scroll that contained her formal message had been prepared with calligraphy that demonstrated Yamatai's mastery of the literary arts alongside its spiritual and material accomplishments. The message itself, preserved in Chinese historical records for all time, spoke in language that balanced appropriate deference with unmistakable royal authority. Himiko addressed the Wei emperor as an equal ruler seeking friendship between distant but equally legitimate sovereigns. She proposed trade agreements that would benefit both realms, offered her confederation support against mutual enemies, and requested formal recognition of her status as queen of all the Wa lands. The document had been composed with careful attention to Chinese diplomatic conventions while asserting Yamatai's independent sovereignty in terms that could not be misunderstood. The Chinese court's response exceeded all expectations. The emperor, impressed by the evident sophistication of this distant island queen, granted her the formal title, Queen of Wa, friendly to Wei, recognition that placed her on the list of legitimate foreign rulers worthy of imperial attention. More significantly, he ordered the creation of a golden seal inscribed with characters that confirmed her authority, a treasure that would become one of the most sacred objects in Himiko's possession and a symbol of her confederation's place in the wider world. The gifts that accompanied this recognition told their own story of mutual respect and careful calculation. 100 bronze mirrors, each polished to reflect not only light but status, would find their way into the graves of Yamatai's elite as symbols of connection to the continental empire. Lengths of Chinese silk would be distributed among allied chiefs as tokens of their queen's successful diplomacy. Swords forged with techniques unknown to island smiths would enhance the military capabilities of Himiko's confederation while demonstrating the practical benefits of friendship with Wei. But perhaps most valuable of all were the intangible gifts of knowledge and prestige that flowed from this successful embassy. Word spread throughout the Japanese archipelago that Himiko had been formally recognized by the greatest power on earth, that her authority now carried the weight of imperial approval, that alliance with Yamatai meant connection to the sophisticated world beyond the sea. Tribal chiefs who might have remained neutral in the Confederation's expansion now sought formal alliance, while potential rivals reconsidered their opposition in light of Himiko's enhanced international status. The return journey became a triumph that was celebrated in every harbor where the diplomatic ships made landfall. Bonfires bloomed along coastlines to mark their passage, and the bronze bells of countless villages rang in celebration of their queen's success. The treasures they carried were not merely Chinese gifts, but tangible proof that Yamatai had achieved recognition as a legitimate power, that its people were no longer isolated islanders, but participants in the grand diplomatic dance that shaped the destiny of nations. In the years that followed this first successful mission, the exchange between Yamatai and Wei became a regular rhythm that marked the seasons like the migration of cranes. Ships carrying tribute and trade goods crossed the dangerous waters according to schedules that balanced seasonal sailing conditions with diplomatic necessities. Each successful voyage strengthened the bonds between the island confederation and the continental empire, while enhancing Himiko's prestige among her own people and rival kingdoms alike. The political architecture that Himiko constructed across the Japanese archipelago resembled the intricate web of a master weaver, with threads of alliance, obligation, and shared spiritual belief binding diverse communities into a confederation that was stronger than the sum of its parts. Each kingdom that acknowledged her authority maintained its local customs and leadership, while participating in a larger pattern of mutual support and coordinated action. This was governance through consensus and charisma rather than coercion, power exercised through the subtle manipulation of spiritual and economic incentives rather than the crude application of military force. The 30 kingdoms that formed the core of her confederation stretched across a geography as varied as their individual traditions. Mountain villages where terraced rice fields climbed steep slopes like green staircases. Coastal settlements where the rhythm of life followed the ebb and flow of tides. River communities where trade boats carried goods and news between highland and lowland settlements. Each contributed its unique strengths to the collective enterprise, while maintaining the distinctive character that made local identity meaningful. In the highlands of central Honshu, where morning mist clung to ancient forests and hot springs bubbled with the earth's inner fire, the Confederation's metalworkers had established foundries that produced bronze implements of unprecedented quality. The ore that fed these furnaces came from mines blessed by Himiko's shamans, and the smiths who shaped molten metal into tools and weapons had been trained in techniques that combined practical skill with spiritual awareness. Each bronze mirror that emerged from these workshops carried not only the mark of its maker, but the blessing of the Queen, whose authority legitimized the Confederation's technological advancement. Along the fertile river valleys, where rice agriculture had transformed scattered hunting bands into prosperous farming communities, a network of storage facilities and distribution centers ensured that good harvests in one region could compensate for poor yields in another. This economic integration represented one of Himiko's most significant achievements, for it created practical incentives for cooperation that reinforced the spiritual bonds of her shamanistic authority. Villages that might once have raided each other during times of scarcity now shared resources according to protocols established through diplomatic negotiation rather than military conquest. The Queen's brother, whose name has been lost to history, but whose influence shaped the Confederation's daily governance, served as the practical administrator of this complex political organism. While Himiko communed with spirits and performed the rituals that maintained divine favor, her brother negotiated trade agreements, resolved disputes between member kingdoms, and coordinated the military actions that occasionally became necessary to defend the Confederation's interests. This division of labor allowed both spiritual and temporal authority to be exercised with maximum effectiveness while maintaining the sacred aura that surrounded the Queen's person. The system of tribute and redistribution that connected member kingdoms operated according to principles that balanced economic efficiency with religious significance. Each community contributed to the Confederation's common resources according to its capabilities: rice from agricultural villages, fish from coastal settlements, metal goods from mining regions, pottery from areas with suitable clay, textiles from communities with skilled weavers. These contributions flowed to collection centers that had been established at strategic locations throughout the Confederation's territory, creating an economic network that enhanced both prosperity and political unity. But the objects that moved through this network carried meanings that transcended their material value. A bronze mirror reflected not only light, but the authority of the Queen who blessed its creation. A bolt of silk cloth woven in one village and traded to another carried with it the spiritual protection of the shamans who had blessed the silkworms and guided the hands of the weavers. A ceramic vessel shaped for storing rice embodied prayers for abundance and protection against famine. Commerce became ceremony, and trade transformed into a form of distributed ritual that reinforced the spiritual foundations of political unity. The military dimension of Himiko's confederation operated through a system of mutual defense obligations that discouraged aggression while minimizing the need for standing armies. Each member kingdom maintained a core of trained warriors who could respond to local threats or contribute to larger military actions when the Confederation's interests required coordinated force. These warriors were not merely soldiers, but participants in a martial tradition that emphasized honor, loyalty, and the protection of the weak, values that reinforced the moral authority of Himiko's rule. The weapons they carried reflected the Confederation's technological sophistication and cultural values. Bronze swords forged according to techniques learned through Chinese contacts, bows crafted from woods that grew only in certain sacred groves, armor decorated with symbols that invoked spiritual protection in battle. Each piece of military equipment embodied the integration of practical function with religious meaning that characterized Yamatai's approach to governance. When conflicts arose between member kingdoms, the resolution process followed protocols that emphasized mediation and ceremonial reconciliation rather than punishment and domination. Disputes over trade routes, fishing rights, agricultural boundaries, or marriage alliances were brought before councils, where representatives of neutral kingdoms served as arbitrators. The proceedings themselves followed ritual forms that transformed legal disputes into spiritual exercises, creating outcomes that restored harmony rather than merely determining winners and losers. The most serious conflicts, those that threatened the Confederation's internal stability or external security, required Himiko's direct intervention through divination and spiritual guidance. Her bronze mirrors would be consulted to determine the will of the gods, her dreams analyzed for prophetic significance, her shamanic visions interpreted as divine commentary on human affairs. The solutions that emerged from these spiritual consultations carried an authority that purely human negotiations could never achieve, for they represented not merely the Queen's judgment, but the expressed will of the supernatural powers that governed the universe. This integration of practical governance with spiritual authority created a form of political organization that was remarkably stable and effective for its historical context. The Confederation could respond to external threats with coordinated military action, adapt to economic challenges through resource sharing and trade diversification, and maintain internal unity through shared participation in ritual practices that reinforced collective identity. It was a system that depended heavily on the personal charisma and spiritual gifts of its central figure, but one that had also developed institutional mechanisms for ensuring continuity and stability. The success of this political experiment had not gone unnoticed by neighboring kingdoms and potential rivals. Throughout the Japanese archipelago, Chiefs and petty kings watched Yamatai's growing power with mixtures of admiration, envy, and concern. Some sought alliance and absorption into the confederation, recognizing the advantages of participation in its trade networks and military protection systems. Others maintained careful neutrality, hoping to avoid entanglement in conflicts that might threaten their independence. A few actively opposed Himiko's expansion, gathering their own coalitions of allies in preparation for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation between competing visions of Japanese political organization. The seasonal festivals that marked the passage of time in Himiko's realm served as more than mere celebrations. They were the visible expression of a cosmic order that connected human society to the eternal patterns of heaven and earth. Each ceremony had been refined over generations of shamanic practice into a precise sequence of ritual actions that could channel divine energy into the material world, ensuring that the natural cycles of growth and renewal would continue to sustain human life. The Queen's role in these festivals was central and irreplaceable, for she alone possessed the spiritual authority to serve as intermediary between the visible and invisible realms. The spring rice planting festival transformed the entire confederation into a vast temple, where thousands of participants joined in ceremonies that blessed the seeds, invoked favorable weather, and ensured protection against the insect plagues and plant diseases that could destroy entire harvests. Himiko would begin the ritual by planting the first sacred rice shoots in fields that had been prepared according to specifications handed down through generations of agricultural shamans. Her movements followed patterns that echoed the cosmic dances performed by the gods at the creation of the world, and the songs she sang carried melodies that were said to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of growing things. The preparation for these festivals began weeks in advance, as communities throughout the Confederation created the elaborate costumes, musical instruments, and ceremonial objects that would transform ordinary villages into stages for divine performance. Silk robes were dyed with colors that represented different aspects of spiritual power: the deep red of life force, the golden yellow of solar energy, the green of growing vegetation, the blue of flowing water. Masks were carved from woods that grew only in sacred groves, their features designed to represent the spirits that governed particular aspects of agricultural success. The musical dimension of these celebrations required instruments that could bridge the gap between human artistry and supernatural communication. Bronze bells cast in shapes that created specific harmonic frequencies. Drums covered with skins from animals that had been ritually honored before their sacrifice. Flutes carved from bamboo that had grown in places where the boundary between worlds was thin. Each sound produced by these instruments carried meanings that extended far beyond mere aesthetic pleasure. During the summer festivals that celebrated the sun's highest power, the Queen would perform the sacred dance that reenacted Amaterasu's emergence from the cave where she had hidden after being offended by her brother's violence. This was perhaps the most important ceremony in the Yamatai calendar, for it ensured that the sun goddess would continue to bless the world with her life-giving radiance. The dance itself required preparation that began at dawn and continued through the longest day, as Himiko's body became a vessel through which divine energy could flow into the world. The autumn harvest festivals focused on gratitude and preparation for winter's challenges, as communities gathered to celebrate successful crops while storing enough food to survive the lean months ahead. These ceremonies emphasized the themes of abundance and careful stewardship, acknowledging that prosperity was a gift from the gods that required proper appreciation and responsible management. Himiko's role in these festivals involved blessing the stored grain and other preserved foods, ensuring that they would retain not only their nutritional value, but their spiritual potency throughout the winter months. The winter solstice ceremonies marked the most dangerous and important time in the annual cycle, when the forces of darkness reached their greatest strength and the sun's power fell to its lowest ebb. These rituals required the highest levels of shamanic skill and spiritual preparation, for failure could result in the sun's permanent withdrawal and the end of all life. Himiko would fast for days before the ceremony, purifying her body and mind, until she became a perfect conduit for the cosmic energies that would ensure the sun's return and the promise of another year. The training required to perform these ceremonies at the highest level began in childhood and continued throughout a shaman's lifetime. Young women who showed aptitude for spiritual communication were brought to the queen's court, where they learned not only the specific techniques of ritual performance, but the underlying principles that made such ceremonies effective. They studied the movements of stars and planets, the patterns of weather and season, the life cycles of plants and animals, and the complex relationships between all these natural phenomena. The preservation of this knowledge required sophisticated systems of education and record-keeping that ensured accurate transmission from one generation to the next. Sacred texts were maintained on silk scrolls that recorded not only the words of important chants and prayers, but the precise gestures, timing, and symbolic arrangements that made ritual performance effective. Master shamans worked with promising students to ensure that every detail of ancient ceremonies would be preserved exactly as it had been performed for countless generations. The material culture that supported these ritual practices represented one of the highest achievements of Yamatai civilization. The craftsmen who created ceremonial objects worked according to standards that demanded not only technical excellence, but spiritual purity. Pottery used in religious ceremonies was fired in kilns that had been blessed by shamans and fed with woods from sacred groves. Textiles woven for ritual use incorporated threads that had been spun by women who maintained strict spiritual disciplines throughout the production process. The integration of artistic creation with religious practice meant that even the most mundane objects carried spiritual significance when they were created within the cultural framework of Himiko's confederation. A simple rice bowl became a vessel for containing not just food, but the blessings of the earth spirits who governed agricultural abundance. A length of cloth transformed into a medium for expressing the cosmic patterns that governed the relationship between heaven and earth. A bronze mirror evolved into a tool for communication with the invisible powers that shaped human destiny. The economic impact of this ritual system extended far beyond its immediate religious functions. The creation of ceremonial objects employed thousands of skilled artisans whose products were traded throughout the Confederation and beyond. The festivals themselves attracted visitors from distant kingdoms, who came not only to witness the spiritual performances, but to participate in the trade fairs and diplomatic negotiations that accompanied major religious celebrations. Sacred tourism became a significant source of income and cultural exchange that enhanced Yamatai's prosperity and international influence. Foreign observers who witnessed these ceremonies often returned to their home kingdoms with reports that enhanced Himiko's reputation as a ruler who possessed genuine supernatural powers. The coordination required to organize festival participation across dozens of communities, the artistic sophistication of ceremonial objects and performances, and the evident devotion of participants all testified to a level of political and spiritual authority that few rulers of the time could match. These accounts contributed to the growing legend that surrounded the Queen's name and encouraged other kingdoms to seek alliance with her confederation. The psychological and social functions of the festival system provided benefits that extended throughout the year and affected every aspect of life in the confederation. The shared participation in ritual activities created bonds of common identity that transcended local loyalties and tribal affiliations. The preparation for major ceremonies required cooperation between communities that might otherwise have little contact with each other. The redistribution of goods that accompanied religious celebrations helped to equalize wealth and reduce social tensions that might otherwise have threatened political stability. The morning mists that wrapped around Himiko's palace carried more than moisture from the distant mountains. They bore the whispered prayers of 1,000 souls, each breath of wind a testament to the sacred order that had settled over Yamatai like a protective shroud. In the pre-dawn hours, when the boundary between the world of spirits and the realm of mortals grew thin as spider's silk, the Queen's fortress awakened not with the clatter of weapons or the harsh commands of guards, but with the gentle susurration of ritual and reverence. Within the innermost chambers of her towered stronghold, Himiko began each day in communion with forces that had shaped the islands since time immemorial. The architecture itself seemed to breathe with spiritual purpose, its elevated wooden floors rising above the earth, not merely for protection from floods or vermin, but to lift the sacred dwelling closer to the realm of the kami, those divine essences that dwelt in every mountain peak, every ancient tree, every flowing stream that fed the rice paddies of her domain. The Queen's 1,000 female attendants moved through the palace corridors like a living prayer, their silk garments rustling with the rhythm of ancient ceremonies. Each had been chosen, not merely for grace or beauty, but for their sensitivity to the unseen currents that flowed through the spiritual landscape of Yamatai. They were daughters of chieftains, sisters of shamans, young women who had shown the spark of otherworldly awareness that marked them as suitable companions for one who spoke directly with the gods. As the first light touched the eastern peaks, Himiko would emerge from her private quarters wrapped in robes of deep indigo, the color of the pre-dawn sky, embroidered with patterns that told the story of her divine lineage. Golden threads traced the path of the sun across the fabric, while silver represented the moon's eternal dance. Around her throat lay a necklace of jade and bronze mirrors, each polished surface reflecting not only light, but the very essence of the cosmic forces she commanded. The ritual of morning divination began before the household stirred, in a chamber, at the palace's highest point, where the roof opened to the sky. Here, surrounded by bronze vessels filled with sacred water and incense burners that sent aromatic smoke spiraling upward, Himiko would cast the oracle bones that revealed the day's spiritual weather. The patterns of cracks in heated tortoise shells spoke to her of favorable winds for merchant ships, of the need for rain ceremonies in distant provinces, of threats gathering beyond the visible horizon that only her divine sight could perceive. Her single male attendant, a man of middle years whose voice had been trained never to rise above a whisper, would enter only when summoned by the soft chiming of bronze bells. He moved through the palace like a shadow, carrying messages between the Queen and the outside world, his presence so unobtrusive that visitors sometimes wondered if he existed at all. Through him, Himiko's will flowed to her brother, who handled the day-to-day governance of Yamatai's 30 allied kingdoms, while she maintained the spiritual equilibrium upon which all earthly order depended. Beyond the palace walls, the people of Yamatai lived their daily lives within a framework of belief that made no distinction between the practical and the sacred. The rice farmers who tended the emerald paddies that stretched between forested hills began their work with offerings to the kami of the fields, small mounds of salt and rice wine placed at the corners of each plot to ensure the blessing of abundant harvest. Their bronze tools were not merely implements but sacred objects, blessed by local shamans and inscribed with protective symbols that warded off both blight and evil spirits. In the craftsmen's quarters, where bronze smiths and weavers practiced arts learned from continental masters, the rhythm of creation itself became a form of worship. The blacksmiths who forged the mirrors that were Yamatai's most precious trade goods understood that they were shaping more than mere metal. Each mirror was a window between worlds, a tool for divination that could capture and reflect the light of divine truth. The process of their making required not only technical skill but spiritual purity, and the master craftsmen fasted and purified themselves before beginning work on the most important pieces. The weavers, mostly women whose fingers moved across, their looms with the grace of dancers, created textiles that told stories in thread and dye. Hemp and silk formed the foundation of their art, but the patterns they wove carried deeper meaning. Geometric designs spoke of cosmic harmony, while flowing curves echoed the movement of wind and water. The deep blues came from indigo plants tended in sacred groves, while the rich reds were extracted from safflower petals gathered at dawn by young maidens singing ancient songs. The marketplace of Yamatai's central settlement buzzed with activity that reflected the kingdom's position at the crossroads of trade routes stretching from the Korean peninsula to the southern islands. Merchants from distant lands brought not only goods but stories, and the exchange of tales was considered as valuable as the trading of silk for bronze or rice for precious stones. The market women, their voices rising and falling in the musical cadences of bargaining, served as informal keepers of news and wisdom, their stalls becoming gathering places where information flowed as freely as the sake that sealed important deals. Children grew up immersed in this world where every action carried spiritual significance. They learned their letters by copying out prayers and invocations, their first writing exercises, creating protective charms that would be hung from the eaves of their homes. Boys destined for the warrior class practiced not only with wooden swords, but with the meditation techniques that would allow them to find the spiritual center necessary for true martial skill. Girls who showed signs of shamanic ability were taken to special schools where elderly priestesses taught them to recognize the voices of spirits and to interpret the messages carried by birds, by the pattern of clouds, by the way morning light fell across the surface of still water. The political structure of Yamatai reflected Himiko's understanding that true authority flowed not from force of arms alone, but from the harmony between earthly governance and divine will. The 30 kingdoms that acknowledged her supremacy did so not as conquered territories, but as willing participants in a sacred confederation. Each maintained its own local customs and traditions, its own shrines and seasonal festivals, but all recognized that their individual prosperity depended on their connection to the spiritual power that flowed from Himiko's mountain stronghold. Her brother, whose name has been lost to the mists of time, but whose wisdom was renowned throughout the islands, served as the visible face of royal authority. He held court in a great hall whose pillars were carved with the symbols of all 30 kingdoms, where representatives gathered at the turning of each season to report on their domains and to receive guidance for the challenges ahead. Unlike the harsh assemblies of purely military rulers, these gatherings resembled religious festivals as much as political councils. The delegates who traveled to these seasonal courts brought more than reports of crop yields and trade agreements. They carried the spiritual pulse of their territories, news of omens and portents that had appeared in their lands, requests for Himiko's intervention in matters that touched the realm of the supernatural. A drought in one kingdom might be traced to the disruption of ancient burial grounds by careless construction. Flooding in another could signal the displeasure of river spirits offended by the pollution of sacred waters. Himiko's responses to these challenges demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of governance that had allowed her to unite such a diverse confederation. She might send teams of shrine maidens to purify polluted sites, their presence serving both spiritual and practical purposes, as their rituals often included the physical cleaning of waterways and the proper disposal of waste. For regions suffering from crop failures, she would dispatch not only emergency stores of rice, but also agricultural specialists who understood the spiritual as well as technical aspects of farming, men and women who could read the subtle signs that indicated when fields needed rest or when new irrigation channels should be dug. The Confederation's military strength lay not in vast standing armies, but in the network of loyalty that Himiko's spiritual authority had created. Each kingdom maintained its own warriors, men trained in the arts of war, but also initiated into the mysteries that transformed mere fighters into guardians of the sacred order. They wore bronze armor polished to mirror brightness, not merely for protection, but to reflect the divine light that validated their cause. Their weapons were blessed in ceremonies that invoked the protection of ancestral spirits, and before any major conflict, they would seek guidance through divination rituals that determined the most auspicious timing for their actions. The passage of time in Yamatai was measured not merely by the movement of sun and moon, but by the great cycle of festivals that marked the turning points of the agricultural and spiritual year. Each celebration served multiple purposes, binding the communities together through shared ritual, while providing opportunities for trade, diplomacy, and the exchange of cultural innovations that kept the Confederation vibrant and adaptable. The Spring Planting Festival began with processions that wound through every settlement in the Confederation, led by young maidens carrying seedlings blessed in Himiko's palace shrine. The Queen herself, though rarely seen by common folk, would appear on her palace's highest balcony during these ceremonies, her presence visible to the crowds below as a distant figure in flowing robes, her raised hands calling down the blessing of Amaterasu, upon the coming growing season. The sight of her silhouette against the sky sent waves of reverence through the assembled thousands, their voices joining in ancient chants that had been sung since the first rice grains took root in Japanese soil. Summer brought the festivals of water and wind, celebrations that honored the kami of rivers and storms, whose favor was essential for the growing crops. Elaborate boat races on decorated vessels carried offerings to the spirits of the sea, while mountaintop bonfires sent smoke signals that were believed to carry prayers directly to the heavenly realm. During these warm months, traveling performers moved between settlements, their dances and songs carrying news and traditions from distant parts of the Confederation, weaving the diverse kingdoms into a shared cultural tapestry. The autumn harvest festivals marked the culmination of the agricultural year, times of thanksgiving that also served as opportunities for the redistribution of resources that kept the Confederation stable. Surplus grain from abundant regions found its way to areas that had suffered poor harvests. This sharing presented not as charity, but as the natural flow of blessings that occurred when all parts of the Confederation maintained their proper relationship with the divine order. The bronze mirrors and silk textiles that were Yamatai's most valuable exports were distributed during these festivals, ensuring that even the humblest communities possessed objects of beauty and spiritual significance. Winter brought the most solemn celebrations, ceremonies that honored the ancestors and sought their guidance for the year ahead. In every household, altar spaces were prepared with offerings of rice wine and carefully preserved foods, while the smoke of incense carried prayers to the spirits of those who had passed beyond the veil. It was during these dark months that Himiko's power as a mediator between worlds became most evident, as she conducted the great rituals that ensured the return of light and warmth, her voice joining with those of shamans throughout the Confederation, in chants that had the power to call back the sun from its winter journey. The education system that flourished under Himiko's reign reflected her understanding that true knowledge must integrate the practical with the spiritual, the temporal with the eternal. In schools attached to local shrines, children learned not only the skills they would need for their adult occupations, but also the deeper wisdom that would allow them to live in harmony with the unseen forces that shaped their world. Young scholars, studying the Chinese writing system that had been adapted for recording Japanese speech, learned each character not merely as a symbol for sound or meaning, but as a vessel for spiritual power. The act of writing became a form of meditation, the careful formation of each stroke requiring the same mindfulness that was cultivated in religious practice. The texts they copied included not only practical information about agriculture, medicine, and statecraft, but also philosophical works that explored the relationship between human action and cosmic harmony. Medical knowledge in Yamatai combined techniques learned from Chinese masters with indigenous shamanic practices that recognized illness as often having spiritual as well as physical causes. Healers trained in these arts could set broken bones and prepare herbal remedies, but they also understood the importance of addressing the emotional and spiritual imbalances that might have contributed to a patient's condition. Their diagnosis included not only examination of physical symptoms, but also divination to determine whether the illness might be connected to violations of taboo, neglect of ancestral obligations, or other disruptions of proper spiritual order. The astronomical knowledge that was essential for maintaining the calendar and predicting eclipses was taught alongside divination techniques that read meaning in the movements of celestial bodies. Students learned to calculate the timing of solstices and equinoxes, but they also studied the mythological stories that explained why these events occurred, understanding that the mechanical and the magical were simply different aspects of a single cosmic dance that human beings could observe, but never fully control. Agricultural instruction emphasized the spiritual dimension of farming that made the difference between mere subsistence and true abundance. Students learned the technical aspects of rice cultivation, the proper timing for planting and harvesting, the construction of irrigation systems, and the selection of seeds. But they also studied the rituals that honored the kami of the fields, the offerings that ensured divine favor, and the signs in nature that warned of coming droughts or floods. This integrated knowledge allowed Yamatai's farmers to achieve yields that seemed miraculous to visitors from lands where such wisdom had been forgotten or never learned. The commercial networks that connected Yamatai to the wider world reflected Himiko's diplomatic genius as much as her people's craftsmanship. The kingdom's position as a center of trade depended not only on the quality of its goods, but on the reputation for fair dealing and spiritual protection that made merchants eager to do business with her confederation. The bronze mirrors that were Yamatai's signature export carried value far beyond their material worth, serving as symbols of divine favor that rulers throughout East Asia sought to possess. The silk textiles produced by Yamatai's weavers incorporated techniques learned from Korean and Chinese masters, but developed their own distinctive aesthetic that reflected the spiritual sensibilities of their creators. The patterns woven into these fabrics told stories that could be read by those initiated into their meanings, creating garments that served as both clothing and sacred text. Foreign ambassadors who received such textiles as gifts understood that they were being honored with objects that carried the blessing of Himiko herself, making these fabrics prized possessions that were often preserved for generations. The pearl. Divers who worked the waters around Yamatai's coastal settlements possessed skills that bordered on the supernatural, their ability to hold their breath and navigate underwater currents seeming to demonstrate a special relationship with the kami of the sea. The pearls they retrieved were not merely ornaments, but spiritual tools, their lustrous surfaces believed to hold the power to purify water and ward off evil influences. The most perfect specimens were reserved for use in important ceremonies, while lesser pearls found their way into the trade networks that carried Yamatai's influence across the known world. The craftsmen who worked with imported materials demonstrated the cultural synthesis that was one of Himiko's greatest achievements. Chinese techniques for working with iron and bronze were adapted to create objects that served distinctly Japanese spiritual purposes, while Korean methods of ceramic production were modified to produce vessels suitable for indigenous ritual practices. This creative adaptation allowed Yamatai to participate fully in the technological advances of the continental civilizations while maintaining its own cultural identity. The merchant ships that carried Yamatai's goods to distant markets sailed under the protection of sea kami invoked through elaborate blessing ceremonies. Before each major voyage, the vessels would be purified with salt water and sacred fire, their hulls painted with protective symbols that were renewed at every port. The sailors themselves were chosen not only for their nautical skills, but for their ability to recognize and respond to the spiritual signs that might appear during their journeys, making them as much pilgrims as traders in their travels across the dangerous waters that separated the Japanese islands from the mainland. As the seasons turned and the years accumulated like layers of silk in a weaver's chest, the confederation that Himiko had built through wisdom and spiritual power grew stronger rather than weaker. The bonds that held the 30 kingdoms together were reinforced not by fear or force, but by the shared understanding that their prosperity depended on maintaining their connection to the divine order that flowed through their queen like water, through the channels of a perfectly designed irrigation system. Each festival strengthened these connections. Each trade mission carried their influence further across the known world. Each generation of children raised in the schools and shrines of Yamatai added to the spiritual momentum that seemed to promise eternal stability for their remarkable civilization. Yet even as the kingdom flourished under the gentle guidance of its shaman queen, subtle changes were stirring in the wider world that would eventually challenge the order she had created. New powers were rising on the mainland. New ideas were spreading along the trade routes, and new generations were coming of age who would test the flexibility and resilience of the system that had brought peace and prosperity to the Japanese islands for more than half a century. The question that began to whisper itself through the morning mists that surrounded Himiko's palace was whether the sacred confederation could adapt to these coming changes while preserving the essential harmony that was its greatest strength, or whether the very perfection of what had been achieved would become a barrier to the transformation that the future would demand. Yet even as these peaceful rituals unfolded beneath Himiko's watchful gaze, the very foundations upon which her kingdom rested began to shift like sand beneath the tide. The confederation that had seemed so unshakable in its devotion now trembled with subtle fractures, hairline cracks that spoke of deeper tensions brewing in the hearts of men who had grown restless with decades of prosperity. In the outer territories of the confederation, where the mountains met the sea and the mists rolled thick through ancient forests, whispers began to circulate like autumn leaves caught in restless winds. These were not the rebellious cries of conquered peoples, but something far more dangerous, the murmurs of allies who questioned whether the time had come for change. The very success of Himiko's reign had bred a generation of lords who had never known the chaos that preceded her rule. Men who looked upon the queen's secluded fortress and wondered whether such mysteries were still necessary in an age of bronze tools and Chinese silk. Chief among these restless voices was Takaru, lord of the mountain stronghold of Kuna, a man whose grandfather had been among the first to bend the knee to Himiko's spiritual authority. Takaru was not a revolutionary by nature, but a pragmatist who looked upon the changing world with calculating eyes. He had seen the Chinese merchants arrive with their strange books and foreign gods, had heard tales of great kings across the water who ruled not through divine communication, but through the strength of their armies and the wisdom of their counselors. "She speaks to spirits that we cannot see," Takeru would say to his trusted advisors as they gathered in his stone hall, where firelight danced across walls decorated with both ancient totems and newly acquired Chinese bronzes. Yet the world, beyond our shores, speaks of rulers who govern with visible wisdom, who lead armies into battle and negotiate treaties with their own voices. Perhaps the time of hidden queens has passed. These conversations, conducted in hushed tones around hearthfires and in shadowed alcoves, reached Himiko's ears through the vast network of servants, merchants, and wandering priests who moved like invisible threads throughout her realm. Yet the aging queen received these reports not with anger, but with a profound sadness that seemed to settle upon her like the weight of countless seasons. She understood, perhaps better than any, that the very peace she had brought to the islands carried within it the seeds of its own transformation. Time moved differently within the walls of Himiko's fortress, flowing like honey through chambers where incense burned eternally and silk curtains filtered the harsh light of day into something softer, more forgiving. Yet even here, in this sanctuary removed from the ordinary passage of seasons, the queen could not escape the relentless advance of years upon her mortal form. Her hair, once black as a moonless night, now bore threads of silver that caught the light like captured starbeams. Her hands, so skilled in the intricate gestures of ritual and divination, moved with less certainty than they once had. The women who served her, those 1,000 devoted souls who had dedicated their lives to her service, watched these changes, with eyes filled with love and growing concern. They saw how the queen would sometimes pause in the middle of a ceremony, her gaze turning inward as if listening to voices that grew more distant with each passing day. They observed how she would stand for long hours at her tower window, looking out over the land she had governed for more than 30 years, her expression holding depths of wisdom and weariness that spoke of burdens too heavy for any mortal soul to bear. Among these faithful servants, none understood the queen's inner struggles more clearly than Miyuki, an elderly woman who had been among the first to join Himiko's household decades earlier. Miyuki had been a young girl when the queen first rose to power, and she had grown old in service to this mysterious ruler, whose face she had seen perhaps a dozen times in all those years. Yet through countless small interactions, the passing of meals through silk screens, the delivery of messages written in Himiko's careful script, the preparation of ritual implements according to precise instructions, Miyuki had come to know the queen's heart perhaps better than any other living soul. It was Miyuki who first noticed that the queen's periods of seclusion had grown longer, that the elaborate rituals which once occurred with clockwork regularity now sometimes stretched far beyond their appointed hours. It was Miyuki who observed that the queen's appetite had diminished, that the carefully prepared meals returned to the kitchens barely touched. Most troubling of all, it was Miyuki who heard the queen speaking alone in her chambers during the deep hours of night, carrying on conversations with invisible presences in tones that ranged from questioning to pleading to profound despair. The spirits grow quiet, Himiko confided to her one day, her voice carrying through the silken barrier that separated them like a whisper from another world. Once they came to me as clearly as the sound of rain upon stone, as bright as morning, light upon water. Now they speak in riddles that grow fainter with each moon, and I fear that I am losing the very gifts that made me worthy to rule. This confession, shared in a moment of vulnerability, revealed the terrible isolation that had always been the price of Himiko's extraordinary power. For all her life, she had stood apart from ordinary human connection, elevated above the common. Experiences of love, friendship, and simple companionship by the awesome responsibility of her sacred role. She had never known the comfort of an equal, never experienced the joy of sharing her thoughts and fears with someone who could truly understand the weight of her position. As whispers of the Queen's aging spread throughout the Confederation, carried on the wings of rumor and careful observation, a question began to emerge that had never before been spoken aloud. Who would succeed the great Himiko when her earthly reign came to an end? This was not merely a political concern, but a spiritual crisis that struck at the very heart of how the islands understood their relationship with the divine. For Himiko was not simply a ruler who could be replaced by another of royal blood. She was the conduit through which the gods spoke to the mortal world, the irreplaceable link between earth and heaven. The Queen herself had never married, never borne children who might inherit her mystical gifts along with her temporal authority. This had been a deliberate choice, part of the sacred compact that had elevated her above ordinary human concerns and allowed her to serve as an uncompromised vessel for divine will. Yet now, as the inevitable approach of mortality cast its shadow across her realm, this choice revealed itself as perhaps the greatest challenge her people would face. In the council halls of the various kingdoms that comprised her confederation, learned men debated this question with growing urgency. Some argued that Himiko's spiritual authority was so unique, so perfectly suited to her individual nature, that it could never be transferred to another. These voices suggested that her death would mark the end of an era, necessitating a return to the older forms of governance that had existed before her rise, perhaps a council of kings who would rule collectively, guided by their own priests and advisors, but answering to no supreme spiritual authority. Others insisted that the gods would surely provide another vessel for their will, that among the young women who served in temples throughout the islands, there must be one who possessed the seeds of supernatural gift waiting to bloom under proper cultivation. These hopeful souls pointed to various candidates, daughters of noble families who had shown unusual sensitivity to spiritual matters, temple maidens who had demonstrated remarkable skill in divination, even common-born girls who had been visited by prophetic dreams. Yet perhaps the most intriguing proposal came from an unexpected source. Himiko's own brother, the man who had served as her earthly administrator for all these years while she attended to spiritual matters. Though he had always remained carefully in the background, this prince had proven himself a capable and trusted leader, respected by the Confederation's various kings for his fair dealing and practical wisdom. Some began to suggest that he might serve as a regent, maintaining the stability of the realm while the search for a true spiritual successor continued. But the prince himself remained silent on these matters, loyal to his sister's wishes, and unwilling to presume upon her authority while she still lived. He continued to carry out his duties with the same quiet efficiency that had marked his service for decades, yet those who worked closely with him noticed new lines of worry creasing his weathered face, new hesitation in his once confident decisions. The burden of potentially inheriting a fragmenting realm weighed heavily upon a man who had never sought supreme power for himself. While domestic concerns swirled like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, the external pressures facing Himiko's realm grew increasingly complex as well. The relationship with the Wei dynasty, which had brought such prestige and prosperity to the Confederation, now carried new complications as both sides of the relationship evolved and changed. The Chinese court, once content to receive tribute and grant recognition to a distant island queen, had begun to take a more active interest in the internal affairs of their overseas vassals. New ambassadors arrived from the mainland, men of learning, and sophistication, who spoke not only of trade and tribute, but of administrative reforms and governmental innovations that had proven successful in the Chinese territories. They brought with them scrolls containing detailed accounts of how other vassal kingdoms had been integrated more closely into the imperial system, how local rulers had been educated in Chinese methods of taxation, law, and military organization. These diplomatic missions, conducted with perfect courtesy and clothed in language of mutual respect and friendship, nevertheless carried an unmistakable subtext. The Wei dynasty was evolving in its approach to foreign relations, moving toward a more hands-on style of imperial management, where once they had been content to receive acknowledgement of their supremacy from distant rulers, they now sought to export their own models of governance, to shape their vassals more closely in their own image. For Himiko, these developments presented a profound dilemma. The Chinese connection had been instrumental in establishing her authority and maintaining peace among the Confederation's various kingdoms. The prestige of imperial recognition, the material benefits of trade, and the deterrent effect of Chinese backing had all contributed to the stability of her reign. Yet the spiritual foundations of her authority were deeply rooted in indigenous traditions that bore little resemblance to Chinese models of governance. The Chinese ideal of the emperor as the son of heaven, ruling through the mandate of heaven, had certain superficial similarities to Himiko's role as a divine intermediary. But the practical implications were vastly different. Chinese imperial ideology emphasized the emperor's active role in governing, his visible presence in state ceremonies, his direct involvement in military and administrative affairs. Himiko's power, by contrast, derived precisely from her mystery, her separation from ordinary human concerns, her invisible but omnipresent spiritual influence. As the Chinese ambassadors lingered at her court, requesting audiences that she could not grant without compromising her sacred isolation, proposing administrative innovations that would require her direct involvement in mundane affairs, Himiko found herself caught between competing visions of what her realm should become. To reject Chinese guidance might jeopardize the relationship that had brought such benefits to her people, yet to embrace it too enthusiastically might undermine the very foundations of her authority and lead to the spiritual crisis her critics already whispered was approaching. The Queen's responses to these diplomatic challenges became increasingly delayed and oblique, filtered through multiple layers of intermediaries and clothed in language so ceremonial and abstract that their actual meaning remained deliberately unclear. The Chinese ambassadors, trained in the subtle arts of diplomatic interpretation, began to sense that something fundamental was shifting in their relationship with this mysterious island realm. As if the natural world itself had begun to mirror the tensions growing within Himiko's realm. The final years of her reign were marked by a series of unusual phenomena that sent ripples of unease throughout the Confederation. It began with subtle changes that only the most observant noticed. The timing of seasonal rains shifted slightly, arriving earlier in some regions and later in others. Birds that had followed predictable migration patterns for generations began to appear in unexpected places, their calls carrying unfamiliar notes that seemed to speak of displacement and uncertainty. The rice harvests, while still abundant, showed variations that troubled the farmers who had grown accustomed to the remarkable consistency that had marked the Queen's reign. Some fields yielded crops of unusual colors, grains tinged with gold that gleamed like metal, or stalks that grew to extraordinary heights before bending under their own weight. These anomalies were not necessarily harmful, but they represented a departure from the natural order that had prevailed for so long under Himiko's guidance. More disturbing still were the reports that began to filter in from the Confederation's border regions, tales of lights seen dancing in the sky during the darkest hours of night, glowing orbs that moved with purpose through the star-filled heavens before vanishing as suddenly as they had appeared. Fishermen spoke of unusually calm seas that stretched, like mirrors to the horizon, so still that their boats seemed to float suspended between two identical skies. Others reported waters that churned and boiled without wind, as if stirred by invisible hands beneath the surface. The priests and shamans throughout the Confederation worked overtime to interpret these phenomena, conducting elaborate ceremonies designed to divine their meaning and determine appropriate responses. Yet their findings remained frustratingly ambiguous, offering contradictory messages that seemed to shift depending on the methods of divination employed. Some readings suggested that the gods were preparing for a great transformation, that the unusual events marked the approach of a new era in which the relationship between heaven and earth would be fundamentally altered. Others indicated that the natural order was responding to some disturbance in the spiritual realm, a disruption in the cosmic harmony that had previously maintained such perfect balance. Himiko herself received these reports with a mixture of fascination and profound concern. She spent increasingly long hours in solitary meditation, seeking to understand what the changing patterns might mean for her realm and her people. Her own connection to the spiritual forces that governed natural phenomena had always been her greatest strength. Yet now she found that very connection becoming clouded and uncertain. During one particularly intense night of ritual observation, as she watched from her tower window while strange lights danced across the northern sky, Himiko experienced what would prove to be one of her final clear visions. In this revelation, she saw her realm as if from a great height, spread out below her like a living map illuminated by supernatural radiance. She could perceive the currents of spiritual energy that flowed between the various kingdoms, the intricate web of loyalty and dependence that bound the Confederation together. But as she watched, she saw those currents beginning to shift and weaken, like rivers slowly changing their course or tributaries gradually drying up. The bonds that had seemed so strong and permanent revealed themselves to be more fragile than she had realized, dependent upon her continued presence and active spiritual intervention. The vision made clear what she had long suspected, but refused to acknowledge. Her realm's stability was not a permanent achievement, but a delicate balance that required constant maintenance that an aging and increasingly isolated queen might not be able to provide indefinitely. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of Himiko's position was how her very success had gradually separated her from the human connections that might have sustained her through these mounting challenges. The sacred isolation that had been essential to establishing her authority, the mysterious distance that had transformed her from an ordinary woman into a figure of divine legend, now became a prison from which there seemed no escape without, destroying everything she had built. The 1,000 women who served her remained devoted and loyal, yet even they existed at a carefully maintained distance, prevented by centuries of protocol from offering the simple human comfort of genuine friendship. They could anticipate her needs, fulfill her commands, and demonstrate their devotion through flawless service. But they could not sit beside her as equals and share the weight of her fears and doubts. The barrier between ruler and ruled, sacred and profane, had become so absolute that it no longer admitted of any crossing. Her brother, that faithful administrator who had served as her earthly hands for so many years, remained her closest confidant. Yet even he was constrained by the formal requirements of their relationship. Their conversations, conducted through intermediaries and wrapped in ceremonial language, could address matters of policy and administration, but rarely touched upon the personal struggles that increasingly consumed the Queen's thoughts. He could see her burden, but could not share it. He could observe her isolation, but could not breach it without fundamentally altering the nature of her authority. The foreign ambassadors who continued to arrive at her court expected to encounter a ruler they could negotiate with directly, a monarch who would receive them in person and engage in the ordinary diplomatic protocols that governed relations between states. Yet Himiko's commitment to her sacred role made such interactions impossible. She was forced to communicate through layers of intermediaries. Her words filtered through multiple translations and interpretations until their original meaning often became obscured or lost entirely. This diplomatic isolation was beginning to create practical problems for the Confederation. The Chinese representatives, accustomed to more direct forms of negotiation, grew increasingly frustrated with the elaborate protocols that surrounded any attempt to communicate with the Japanese Queen. Their reports back to the Wei court began, to express subtle doubts about the effectiveness of their island ally. Questions about whether a ruler who remained so removed from practical affairs could truly represent the interests of her people in the complex negotiations that were becoming necessary as trade relationships grew more sophisticated. During the long nights when sleep eluded her, Himiko would often find herself wondering what her life might have been like if she had chosen a different path. She tried to imagine herself as an ordinary woman, free to love and marry, to raise children and grow old surrounded by family, to experience the simple pleasures and sorrows that marked the lives of her subjects. Yet these fantasies always dissolved. In the face of her deeper understanding, her gifts had never offered her a choice. From the moment she first felt the touch of the divine upon her soul, her destiny had been sealed. The tragedy of her position lay not in any particular failure or mistake, but in the very nature of the role she had been called to fulfill. To be a conduit between worlds, she had been forced to inhabit neither fully. To speak for the gods, she had been required to silence her own human voice. To serve as the mother of her people, she had been denied the experience of motherhood itself. The price of her extraordinary authority had been the sacrifice of everything that made life ordinary and, in its ordinariness, deeply meaningful. As the seasons turned and the challenges facing her realm continued to multiply, those closest to Himiko began to notice changes that spoke of more than mere aging. The Queen's legendary stamina, which had allowed her to conduct elaborate rituals lasting from sunset to dawn, began to flag noticeably. Ceremonies that had once flowed with effortless grace now required frequent pauses, moments when the royal presence seemed to waver like candlelight in a draught. The carefully maintained schedules that had governed palace life for decades began to shift and adapt around the Queen's diminishing energy. Morning audiences were moved to later hours. Evening rituals were shortened or postponed. The servants, trained to read the smallest signs of their mistress's needs, learned to interpret new signals, the particular quality of silence that indicated she required solitude, the subtle changes in her breathing that suggested exhaustion, the way her hands would tremble almost imperceptibly when she thought herself unobserved. Yet even as her physical strength waned, Himiko's spiritual sensitivity seemed to intensify, as if the approaching dissolution of her mortal form was allowing her divine nature to shine through more clearly. She spoke of dreams that were more vivid than waking life, of visions that came to her with crystalline clarity during the twilight hours between day and night. In these moments of enhanced perception, she claimed to see the true patterns underlying the apparent chaos of her realm's current struggles. "The wheel turns," she told her brother, during one of their increasingly rare direct conversations, her voice carrying a strange mixture of sadness and acceptance. "What has been built must be transformed. What has been gathered must be scattered. What has been unified must find new forms of connection. This is not failure but necessity, not an ending but a preparation for what must come next." These cryptic pronouncements, delivered with the authority of absolute conviction, both comforted and disturbed those who heard them. They suggested that the Queen maintained some profound understanding of the forces shaping her world, that her apparent decline was part of a larger pattern she had foreseen and accepted. Yet they also carried the unmistakable implication that she was preparing for a departure that would leave her people to navigate an uncertain future without the guidance that had sustained them for so long. The provincial lords who comprised the Confederation's leadership began to arrive at the capital with increasing frequency, ostensibly to pay their respects, but actually to assess the situation for themselves. They came with carefully prepared speeches of loyalty and devotion, yet their eyes carried questions they dared not voice aloud. How long could the current situation continue? What preparations should be made for an eventual transition? Could the Confederation survive the loss of its spiritual center? Himiko received these visitors according to ancient protocol, hidden behind silk screens that allowed them to hear her voice, but never see her face. Yet even through this formal barrier, her diminished condition was becoming apparent. Her responses to their presentations grew briefer, her questions less penetrating, her silences longer and more frequent. The aura of mysterious power that had always surrounded these audiences remained, but it was now tinged with something that felt disturbingly like mortality. As winter approached in what would prove to be the final year of her reign, Himiko began to speak more frequently of the need to prepare for change. She issued instructions for the preservation of important records, the training of new ritual specialists, the establishment of procedures that could maintain some continuity of spiritual practice even in her absence. These commands were carried out with meticulous attention to detail, yet everyone involved understood that they were following blueprints for a world they could barely imagine, a world without the Queen whose presence had defined their reality for more than 3 decades. The last clear directive she gave concerned the great bronze mirror that had served as the primary focus of her spiritual practices, the sacred object through which she had communicated with the divine realm for all these years. This mirror, polished to perfect smoothness and inscribed with symbols whose meaning was known only to her, was to be carefully preserved and protected, maintained as a link to the spiritual forces that had guided her reign even after she was no longer present to serve as their earthly vessel. As the short days of late winter gave way to the earliest hints of spring, those who served in the palace began to notice that the Queen's periods of withdrawal had grown longer still. Sometimes entire days would pass without any direct communication from her chambers, marked only by the thin streams of incense smoke that continued to drift from her windows and the soft sounds of solitary chanting that could occasionally be heard by those who passed near her door. The kingdom held its breath, suspended between the certainty of profound change and the terrible uncertainty of what form that change might take. In the outer provinces, as news of the Queen's condition spread through whispered conversations and carefully coded messages, some communities began to experience their own small upheavals. Ancient rivalries that had been suppressed for decades surfaced in minor disputes over boundaries and resources. Local priests found themselves called upon to provide spiritual guidance that had previously flowed from the central authority. The very fabric of the Confederation, woven together so carefully over the years of Himiko's reign, began to show signs of strain as each thread prepared to bear weight it had never carried alone. Yet through all these mounting pressures and gathering shadows, the realm itself continued to function with a kind of momentum born of long habit and deep loyalty. Farmers planted their rice as they had for generations. Craftsmen pursued their trades with undiminished skill. Merchants continued to travel the established routes that connected the various kingdoms. The ordinary rhythms of life persisted even as the extraordinary circumstances that had shaped them for so long moved inexorably toward their conclusion, like a great symphony approaching its final movement, with all themes converging toward a resolution that would transform everything that had come before into memory. The seasons had turned countless times since Himiko first took the sacred throne, and with each passing cycle, the weight of her years pressed more heavily upon her shoulders. The once vibrant energy that had danced through her slender frame, like lightning, now moved with the measured grace of deep waters. Her hair, which had caught sunlight like spun gold in her youth, had transformed into silver threads that caught moonlight instead, each strand a testament to the wisdom accumulated through decades of communion with the spirit world. In the 13th year of what the Chinese would later record as the Jiangxi era, whispers began to move through the halls of her great fortress, like autumn winds through dying leaves. The Queen's health, which had remained remarkably robust throughout her long reign, began to show the first signs of mortal frailty. Her daily rituals, once performed with the effortless grace of a dancer, now required longer periods of rest between the sacred movements. The bronze mirrors that had reflected her face for so many years seemed to hold shadows that grew deeper with each viewing. Yet even as her physical form began to show the inevitable marks of time, Himiko's spiritual power appeared to intensify, rather than diminish. Her prophecies became more vivid, her communion with the kami more profound. It was as if the approaching threshold between the world of the living and the realm of spirits made her conduit between them ever clearer. The 1,000 women who served her watched in awe as their queen seemed to glow with an inner light that grew brighter even as her earthly vessel grew more fragile. The Chinese envoys who arrived in the autumn of what would be her final year found a ruler whose presence commanded even greater reverence than before. Though she received them from behind the sacred screens, her voice carried a resonance that seemed to speak not just with her own authority, but with the accumulated wisdom of all the spirits who had guided her reign. They brought gifts from the Wei court. Silk so fine it seemed woven from captured starlight. Bronze vessels whose surfaces were etched with dragons that appeared to move in the flickering lamplight. And jade ornaments carved with symbols of longevity and imperial favor. But beneath these ceremonial exchanges, the envoys sensed something deeper, a shifting in the very foundations of the world they had come to know. The great confederation that Himiko had forged through spiritual authority and diplomatic skill was showing signs of strain. Some of the more distant kingdoms had begun to question whether a woman, even one blessed by the kami, could continue to hold together the complex web of alliances that kept peace across the islands. These doubts were not spoken openly, for Himiko's power was still too great, and her spiritual authority too deeply ingrained in the consciousness of her people. But they moved like underground currents, felt rather than seen, and the queen herself was not unaware of them. In the quiet hours before dawn, when she sat in meditation facing the sacred mountains, she could sense the tremors that ran through the spiritual landscape of her realm. The harmony she had spent a lifetime creating was beginning to show the first hairline cracks that might, in time, become fractures. Her brother, now grown old in her service, noticed how her periods of solitary communion grew longer and more frequent. Sometimes, she would disappear into the innermost sanctuary of the fortress for days at a time, emerging only when the phases of the moon required specific rituals to be performed. He worried, as he had learned to do over the long years of their partnership, but he also understood that his sister was preparing for something that lay beyond the horizon of ordinary perception. As winter settled over the land with unusual severity, bringing snow to regions that rarely saw it, and freezing the rivers that normally flowed freely throughout the cold months, Himiko received what would be her most profound and terrible vision. It came not during one of her formal rituals, but in the deep of night, as she lay sleeping in her chamber high in the fortress tower. In this vision, she found herself standing on a vast plain that stretched beyond the limits of sight in every direction. The ground beneath her feet was neither earth nor stone, but something that seemed to pulse with its own inner rhythm, like the heartbeat of the world itself. Above her, the sky was not the familiar blue of day, or the star-scattered black of night, but a deep purple that seemed to contain within it all the colors that had ever been or ever would be. Before her stood a figure of immense presence, neither male nor female, young nor old, but somehow containing the essence of all possibilities. The figure's face was hidden by a veil that shifted and flowed like water, but its voice when it spoke was like the sound of wind through infinite forests, of waves breaking on shores that existed beyond time. "Child of the sun," the figure spoke, and the words seemed to come not through her ears, but directly into the center of her being. "Your path among the living draws toward its completion. The thread you have woven through the tapestry of your people's destiny is strong and true, but all threads must eventually find their proper place in the larger pattern." Himiko felt no fear at these words, only a profound sense of recognition, as if she had always known this moment would come and had been preparing for it throughout her entire reign. "Will the peace endure?" she asked, and her voice in this place seemed to carry the weight of all her hopes and concerns for her people. "Peace is not a thing to be preserved like rice in a storehouse," the figure replied, its veil rippling with currents of light that reminded her of aurora dancing across winter skies. "It is a living creation that must be renewed with each generation. What you have built will transform, as all living things must transform. But the seeds of wisdom you have planted will find new soil in which to grow." The vision showed her glimpses of times to come, great burial mounds rising like artificial mountains across the landscape, magnificent tombs that would house rulers yet unborn. She saw bronze and iron giving way to new arts of war and peace, saw her people's ships venturing farther across the waters than they had ever dared before. She saw temples rising in honor of the kami, their architecture influenced by ideas that would flow across the sea from distant lands. But she also saw periods of strife, times when the unity she had forged would splinter into competing claims and rival authorities. She saw her own name fade from the immediate memory of her people, becoming first legend, then myth, then a mystery that would puzzle scholars in ages yet to come. Yet even in this fading, she understood there was a kind of immortality, not the preservation of her individual self, but the continuation of the principles and wisdom that had guided her reign. Your greatest gift to your people, the figure continued, has not been the peace you maintained or the prosperity you brought, but the demonstration that authority need not rest on force alone. You have shown that wisdom and spiritual insight can govern as effectively as the sword. This lesson will echo through the generations, even when your name is forgotten. When she awoke from this vision, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky, but something had changed in that deep place where her soul connected with the world around her. She could feel the silver cord that bound her spirit to her physical form beginning to loosen, not with the violence of sudden severing, but with the gentle release of a flower letting go its seeds to the wind. In the days that followed her great vision, Himiko began the delicate process of preparing her kingdom for the transition that she now knew was approaching. She did this not with the frantic urgency of one who fears death, but with the careful thoroughness of a master craftsman putting the finishing touches on a lifetime's greatest work. She called her brother to her private chambers and spoke with him at length about the practical matters of governance that would need attention in the immediate aftermath of her passing. Together, they reviewed the complex web of alliances and obligations that held the Confederation together, identifying those relationships that were most robust and those that might require special attention from her successor. The question of succession itself was one that had haunted the edges of political discussion for years. Himiko had never married, and thus there was no direct heir of her bloodline. According to the ancient customs of their people, leadership could pass to a close relative who showed the necessary spiritual gifts, or the various kingdoms might choose to select a new supreme leader through a process of consultation and mutual agreement. The matter was complicated by the fact that Himiko's authority had been so deeply personal, so intimately tied to her individual charisma and spiritual power, that it was unclear whether anyone could simply step into her role and expect the same level of acceptance from the diverse kingdoms of the Confederation. The Chinese recognition of her as Queen of Wa had been granted specifically to her, and whether that recognition would automatically transfer to a successor remained an open question. Among the candidates for succession, two figures emerged as most prominently mentioned in the whispered conversations of the court. The first was Nashim, a young woman of royal blood who had shown remarkable aptitude for the shamanic arts and had served as one of Himiko's most trusted spiritual advisors. Her youth was both an advantage, suggesting that she might reign for many years and provide stability, and a potential weakness, as some questioned whether one so young could command the respect of the various kingdom leaders who had grown accustomed to dealing with the seasoned wisdom of Himiko. The second candidate was more controversial, a male relative named Iyo, whose supporters argued that the succession of a man might provide an opportunity to normalize relations with the Chinese court, where female rulers were viewed as anomalous. However, this suggestion faced significant resistance from those who saw Himiko's female rulership not as an accident of history, but as a fundamental aspect of the spiritual order that had brought such prosperity to their lands. Himiko herself remained carefully neutral in these discussions, understanding that too strong an intervention on her part might actually weaken her chosen successor's eventual position. Instead, she focused on ensuring that the spiritual foundations of leadership remained strong, regardless of who might eventually claim the throne. She spent long hours with the court shamans, recording in careful detail the rituals and practices that maintained the kingdom's connection with the kami. She had bronze tablets created that preserved the most essential ceremonies, ensuring that future generations would have access to the spiritual technologies that had served her reign so well. The Chinese envoys, sensing the shifting currents in the political atmosphere, began to make their own careful preparations for whatever transition might come. They had invested too much in their relationship with the Yamatai Confederation to simply withdraw at the first sign of change. But they also needed to be ready to adapt their diplomatic approach to new circumstances. Secret messages were sent back to the Wei capital, informing the court of the situation and requesting instructions on how to proceed if and when the succession question became immediate. Spring came late that year, as if the natural world itself was reluctant to rush toward the changes that the turning of the seasons would bring. When the plum blossoms finally appeared, they seemed more fragile than usual, their pink petals translucent as rice paper, as though the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds had grown thin. Himiko spent more and more of her time in the highest chamber of her fortress, a circular room whose windows looked out in all directions across her realm. From this vantage point, she could see the smoke rising from countless hearth fires in the settlements below, each plume a testament to the lives being lived under her protection. She could see the fields where farmers were beginning their spring, planting, following rhythms of cultivation that she had helped to stabilize and expand throughout her reign. Her daily routines had simplified to their most essential elements. Each morning, she performed the greeting ritual to the rising sun, her movements now so refined by decades of practice that they seemed less like human gestures than like forces of nature expressing themselves through her form. Each evening, she offered the sunset ceremonies that ensured the benevolent Kami would watch over her people through the night hours. But it was in the deep of night that her most profound work took place. In the hours when the boundary between day and night, between the world of the living and the realm of spirits, grew most permeable. She engaged in practices that no human eye witnessed. These were not the formal rituals known to her court shamans, but something more ancient and more personal, a gradual dissolution of the barriers that separated her individual consciousness from the larger spiritual currents that flowed through her land. Her attendants, the 1,000 women who had served her faithfully throughout her reign, began to notice subtle changes in their queen's presence. When she spoke, which she did less frequently now, her words carried a weight and resonance that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her individual personality. When she moved through the corridors of the fortress, the very air seemed to shimmer around her, as if she were becoming transparent to the spiritual forces that had always moved through her, but were now flowing with less and less obstruction. The Chinese envoys, trained in the careful observation of political nuance, recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience. They had served in many courts and had observed the deaths of emperors and the rise of new dynasties. But what was happening in Himiko's fortress seemed to transcend the ordinary categories of political transition. They began to include in their reports to the Wei capital descriptions that sounded more like spiritual testimony than diplomatic intelligence. As summer deepened into its fullest expression, with the rice fields reaching their peak of emerald, abundance and the cicadas filling the air with their ancient songs, Himiko's physical form began to show the unmistakable signs of approaching departure. She ate little, sustaining herself primarily on the ritual offerings of rice wine and sacred water that had always been part of her daily ceremonies. Her movements became increasingly deliberate and economical, as if she were conserving her energy for purposes that extended beyond the maintenance of bodily life. Yet her mind remained clear, and her spiritual perception sharper than ever. She continued to receive visitors from the various kingdoms of her confederation, offering guidance on matters of governance and spiritual practice with the accumulated wisdom of her long reign. These audiences took on an increasingly formal character, as if she were delivering final teachings rather than engaging in routine consultation. The autumn of what would prove to be Himiko's final year brought with it weather patterns that the elderly among her people remembered as similar to those that had preceded her rise to power decades earlier. Storms moved across the islands with unusual frequency and intensity, followed by periods of crystalline clarity that seemed to render the very air transparent, The leaves on the mountain maples turned colors more vivid than anyone could recall, as if the world itself was preparing for some great ceremony. On a night when the moon was dark and the stars shone with exceptional brilliance, Himiko summoned her brother and her closest advisors to her presence. She spoke to them in the measured cadences that had become characteristic of her recent communications, each word chosen with the precision of a master calligrapher, placing brushstrokes on silk. "The time of my departure from this form approaches," she told them, her voice carrying none of the emotional turbulence that such an announcement might have provoked in an ordinary person facing mortality. "This is not a cause for sorrow, but for understanding. Just as the rivers flow eventually to the sea, and the seasons turn in their eternal cycles, so must individual lives find their proper completion within the larger patterns of existence." She gave specific instructions for the period immediately following her death, emphasizing the importance of maintaining stability and continuity during the inevitable period of adjustment. The Confederation must not be allowed to fragment in the confusion of succession. The relationships with the Chinese court must be preserved even as they adapted to new circumstances. The spiritual practices that had sustained the kingdom's prosperity must continue uninterrupted. Most importantly, she spoke of the manner in which her death should be understood and communicated to her people. "I am not dying," she told them, using words that would be remembered and repeated for generations to come. "I am transforming from one form of service to another. As I have served as the bridge between the kami and the people while dwelling in physical form, so will I continue to serve as a spiritual guardian when I have taken up residence in the realm of pure spirit." 3 days later, as the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the peaks of the sacred mountains, Himiko's attendants found her in her meditation chamber, seated in the formal position she had maintained for countless morning rituals. Her face bore an expression of profound peace, as if she had simply continued her meditation into a realm where the ordinary boundaries of sleep and waking no longer applied. The transition had been so gentle that for a moment her attendants were uncertain whether she had truly departed or had simply entered a deeper level of spiritual trance. But as the morning light grew stronger and filled the chamber with its golden warmth, it became clear that the great queen had indeed completed her earthly service. Her physical form remained upright in meditation posture, but the animating presence that had made her such a powerful force in the world had departed for other realms of existence. The news of Himiko's death moved through the fortress and then across the countryside with the swiftness of wind across water. By evening, messengers were racing toward the far corners of the Confederation, carrying word of the transition to kingdom leaders who would need to make their own preparations for the changes that would inevitably follow. The period of mourning that followed Himiko's death was unlike anything that had been seen in the memory of living generations. It was not merely the formal observance of court protocol, but a genuine outpouring of grief and gratitude from people whose lives had been touched by her reign in ways both profound and subtle. From the fortress where she had ruled, the sounds of mourning drums echoed across the valleys, their deep rhythms carrying messages of loss and transition to communities throughout the realm. The drums spoke in the ancient language that predated written characters, conveying through rhythm and repetition emotions too complex for ordinary words to express. The 1,000 women who had served Himiko directly entered into formal mourning, practices that would continue for a full lunar year. They dressed in white robes that symbolized both death and purification, and they maintained constant vigils around their queen's body as it lay in state in the great hall of the fortress. Each day they performed the ritual chants that were believed to ease the spirit's transition to its new realm of existence, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to make the very walls of the fortress resonate with otherworldly music. Representatives from all 30 kingdoms of the Confederation came to pay their respects, many of them traveling for days across difficult terrain to reach the fortress where their supreme leader lay in state. They brought gifts appropriate to a ruler's funeral, precious metals and rare stones, fine textiles and ceremonial weapons, offerings of rice and wine that represented the prosperity that had flourished under her reign. But more than these material tributes, they brought stories, memories of her wisdom in resolving disputes, accounts of her spiritual interventions during times of crisis, testimonials to the peace and stability that her leadership had brought to lands that had known generations of conflict before her rise to power. These stories were shared in the formal ceremonies of mourning and in the informal gatherings that took place throughout the fortress, creating an oral archive of her reign that would be passed down through generations. The Chinese envoys faced a delicate diplomatic challenge in responding to news of the Queen's death. Their emperor had invested considerable prestige in the relationship with Himiko, recognizing her as the legitimate ruler of all the Japanese islands and conducting formal diplomatic exchanges with her court. Now they needed to navigate the transition period while maintaining their empire's interests and dignity. They participated in the mourning ceremonies with appropriate gravity, presenting gifts from the Wei court that honored both Himiko's memory and the Chinese Empire's continuing commitment to good relations with whatever government might emerge from the succession process. Their presence lent an international dimension to the mourning period, emphasizing the extent to which Himiko's influence had extended beyond the boundaries of her immediate realm. As the weeks passed and the formal mourning period began to structure itself into predictable rhythms, attention gradually turned to the practical questions that had been temporarily set aside in the immediate aftermath of the Queen's death. The most pressing of these was the question of succession, which could not be delayed indefinitely without risking the stability of the entire confederation. The process of selecting Himiko's successor revealed the extent to which her personal authority had been the keystone holding together the complex structure of the confederation. Without her unifying presence, the various kingdoms began to assert their individual interests with a vigor that had been suppressed during her lifetime. The two primary candidates for succession each had their supporters, but neither could claim the universal acceptance that would be necessary to step immediately into Himiko's role. Nashime, the young shamaness who had been among her closest spiritual advisors, had the advantage of gender and religious training, which aligned with the precedent that Himiko's reign had established. Her supporters argued that the kami had clearly shown their approval of female leadership through the prosperity that had marked Himiko's reign, and that departing from this model might anger the spiritual forces that had protected the confederation. However, Nashim's youth and lack of administrative experience gave ammunition to those who favored alternative approaches to the succession. Some kingdom leaders privately expressed concern that a young and inexperienced ruler might not be able to maintain the complex diplomatic relationships that Himiko had cultivated, particularly the crucial connection with the Chinese court. The male candidate, Io, drew support from those who believed that the succession provided an opportunity to bring the Confederation's leadership more in line with the male-dominated models that prevailed in China and other neighboring regions. His supporters argued that male leadership might facilitate better relations with the Chinese Empire and might also be more acceptable to some of the more traditional kingdoms within the Confederation that had chafed under female rule. But this argument faced strong resistance from those who saw gender as irrelevant to spiritual qualification and who pointed out that Himiko's most significant achievements had come precisely from her ability to operate outside the conventional models of male political authority. They argued that attempting to fit the Confederation into standard patterns might actually weaken its unique advantages. As the debate continued, a third faction began to emerge, advocating for a more radical departure from previous practice. Some leaders suggested that the Confederation might benefit from a collective leadership model, with representatives from the various kingdoms taking turns in the supreme leadership role or sharing power in some more formal council structure. This suggestion attracted support from those who had always been somewhat uncomfortable with the concentration of authority in a single individual, regardless of that person's qualifications. However, it also raised complex practical questions about how such a system would function in practice, particularly in dealings with external powers like the Chinese Empire that were accustomed to conducting diplomacy with individual rulers. The Chinese envoys found themselves in the awkward position of being courted by all the various factions, each of which hoped to secure imperial recognition for their preferred candidate or system. The envoys maintained careful neutrality in public, but their private communications back to the Wei capital revealed their concern that the succession dispute might fragment the Confederation to the point where it would no longer be a useful ally for Chinese interests in the region. Meanwhile, the practical business of governance continued under the direction of Himiko's brother and the council of advisors who had assisted her during her lifetime. They were careful to avoid making any decisions that might be seen as prejudging the succession question, but they also worked to maintain the stability and continuity that would be essential regardless of who eventually emerged as the new leader. After months of discussion and negotiation, a solution began to emerge that reflected both the unique circumstances of the succession and the practical necessities of maintaining governmental continuity. Rather than simply selecting one of the competing candidates, the kingdom leaders decided to implement a trial period during which different approaches to leadership could be tested. Initially, they agreed to install Nashime as the new queen, recognizing her spiritual qualifications and the precedent established by Himiko's successful reign. However, this appointment was explicitly structured as a provisional arrangement, subject to review after a period of 3 years. This approach allowed her supporters to demonstrate that young female leadership could indeed provide effective governance, while also providing reassurance to those who had doubts about the arrangement. The decision reflected a sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics involved. By making the appointment provisional, the kingdom leaders avoided the finality that might have led to open resistance from those who favored alternative approaches. At the same time, by giving Nashime a genuine opportunity to prove herself, they allowed for the possibility that she might establish the kind of personal authority that would make her permanent appointment inevitable. The Chinese envoys, after consultation with their home government, agreed to recognize Nashime as the legitimate ruler of the Confederation, though they also made it clear that this recognition was contingent on her ability to maintain the stability and diplomatic commitments that had characterized Himiko's reign. This qualified endorsement gave the new queen the international recognition she needed, while also preserving Chinese flexibility if the political situation continued to evolve. However, the succession process had revealed fault lines within the Confederation that would have long-term consequences for its unity and effectiveness. Some of the more distant kingdoms had used the transition period to assert greater independence from central authority, and it became clear that the new queen would need to invest considerable effort in rebuilding the consensus that had made Himiko's reign so successful. These challenges were compounded by the practical reality that Nashime, despite her spiritual gifts, lacked the decades of experience and accumulated wisdom that had made Himiko such an effective leader. She would need to learn through trial and error lessons that her predecessor had mastered through long practice, and this learning process would inevitably involve mistakes and setbacks that might further weaken confidence in her leadership. While the political succession was being resolved, preparations began for the construction of Himiko's tomb, a project that would serve both as a memorial to her reign and as a demonstration of the Confederation's continued power and unity. The decision to build a monument of unprecedented scale reflected the extraordinary nature of her achievement and the desire to create a lasting symbol of the golden age that her leadership had represented. The site chosen for the tomb was a hilltop, location that commanded views across the heart of her realm, a place where the natural landscape seemed to concentrate the spiritual energies that had flowed through her reign. Archaeological evidence suggests that this location had been considered sacred long before Himiko's time, but her burial there would transform it into a focal point for religious and political pilgrimage that would continue for centuries. The design of the tomb followed traditional patterns, but on a scale that dwarfed previous royal burials. The central burial chamber was surrounded by concentric circles of earthwork that created artificial hills and valleys across several acres of landscape. These earthworks were not merely decorative, but served specific spiritual functions, channeling and concentrating the natural forces that were believed to continue operating through the Queen's departed spirit. The construction project required the coordinated efforts of thousands of workers drawn from throughout the Confederation. Master craftsmen came from the various kingdoms to contribute their specialized skills, metal workers who created bronze vessels and ornaments for the burial chamber, textile workers who wove silk shrouds and ceremonial banners, stone carvers who shaped the megalithic elements that would anchor the tomb's spiritual architecture. But the tomb's most remarkable feature was not its physical grandeur, but the human cost of its construction. According to the Chinese records, which provide the most detailed account of these events, 100 slaves were sacrificed to accompany Himiko in death, following ancient practices that ensured the continued service of attendants in the spiritual realm. This aspect of the burial has been the subject of extensive scholarly debate, with some historians questioning whether the Chinese accounts can be taken at face value. The practice of human sacrifice, while not unknown in ancient Japan, was relatively rare and may have been exaggerated in Chinese sources that were attempting to portray the Japanese as barbarous. However, archaeological evidence from similar tombs of the period does suggest that at least some human sacrifice was associated with royal burials, though perhaps not on the scale reported in the Chinese records. The actual burial ceremony took place during the winter solstice, at the moment when the sun reached its lowest point in the sky and began its return journey towards spring. This timing was carefully chosen to symbolize Himiko's transition from the realm of earthly authority to the sphere of spiritual guidance, with her departure coinciding with the natural cycle of death and renewal that governs all existence. The ceremony itself was attended by representatives from throughout the Confederation and beyond, including Chinese envoys who recorded their observations for posterity. The ritual procession that carried Himiko's body to its final resting place was said to stretch for miles, with participants drawn from every level of society and every corner of her former realm. Himiko's death marked not only the end of an individual reign but the conclusion of an entire era in Japanese history. Her passing coincided with the transition from what archaeologists call the Yayoi period to the Kofun period, a shift that involved fundamental changes in technology, social organization, and cultural expression. The Yayoi period, during which Himiko had lived and ruled, had been characterized by the spread of rice agriculture, the development of bronze and ironworking, and the emergence of increasingly complex social hierarchies. These developments had created the foundation for Himiko's political achievements, providing the agricultural surplus and technological capabilities that made possible the confederation she had assembled. The Kofun period, which began around the time of her death, would be marked by the construction of massive burial mounds, the development of more sophisticated metallurgy, and the emergence of increasingly centralized political authority. In many ways, these developments represented the flowering of trends that had begun during Himiko's reign, as if her example had shown the way toward new forms of political and cultural organization. The great burial mounds that became characteristic of the Kofun period, and which gave the era its name, owed much to the precedent established by Himiko's tomb. The scale and grandeur of her burial monument demonstrated that such massive construction projects were both technically feasible and politically valuable, serving as symbols of authority that could be seen from great distances and that would endure for centuries. But the transition to the Kofun period also involved changes that would have challenged Himiko's political methods. The new era saw the rise of warrior elites who based their authority more on military power than on spiritual guidance, and the development of more hierarchical social structures that left less room for the kind of consensus building that had been central to her approach to governance. The role of women in political leadership, which had reached its apex during Himiko's reign, began to decline as these more militarized forms of authority took hold. While female rulers would continue to appear occasionally in Japanese history, they would never again wield the kind of unquestioned supreme authority that had characterized Himiko's position. These changes reflected broader transformations in Japanese society that extended far beyond the political sphere. The increasing contact with Chinese civilization brought new ideas about governance, religion, and cultural expression that gradually reshaped Japanese society along more hierarchical and male-dominated lines. The shamanic traditions that had provided the foundation for Himiko's authority continued to exist, but were increasingly marginalized by imported forms of Buddhism and Confucianism. Yet even as these larger historical forces moved Japanese society away from the model that Himiko had represented, her influence continued to operate in more subtle ways. The precedent she had established for diplomatic relations with China provided a template that future Japanese rulers would adapt to their own circumstances. The demonstration she had provided of effective confederation building offered lessons that would be applied in later efforts to unify the Japanese islands under central authority. As the centuries passed after Himiko's death, her story began to take on the characteristics of legend rather than history. The immediate political concerns that had dominated the succession period faded in importance as new dynasties rose and fell, but the memory of the great queen who had ruled through spiritual authority rather than military force proved to have remarkable staying power. Part of this persistence can be attributed to the unique nature of her achievement. In a region where political authority was typically based on kinship, military prowess, or administrative efficiency, Himiko had demonstrated that spiritual insight and diplomatic skill could be equally effective foundations for governance. This example provided inspiration for later generations who sought alternatives to purely military or bureaucratic models of leadership. But the transformation of Himiko from historical figure to legendary character also involved the loss of much specific information about her life and reign. The Chinese records that provided the most detailed contemporary accounts of her rule were not widely available in Japan, and the Japanese historical traditions that developed in later centuries had their own reasons for downplaying or omitting references to her reign. The result was that Himiko became increasingly mysterious as time passed. Later Japanese historians, writing under the influence of Chinese models that emphasized male leadership and Confucian values, found it difficult to incorporate a powerful female ruler into their narratives of early Japanese development. Some simply ignored her altogether, while others transformed her into a more conventional figure that fit better with their expectations about how political authority should be exercised. This process of historical erasure was facilitated by the nature of the sources available to later historians. The oral traditions that had preserved memories of her reign gradually evolved as they were passed from generation to generation, with each retelling potentially adding new elements or omitting details that no longer seemed relevant to contemporary audiences. The archaeological record, while rich in material evidence from her period, could not provide the kind of specific information about individual personalities and political relationships that would be necessary to reconstruct a detailed account of her reign. The great tombs and bronze artifacts of the Yayoi and early Kofun periods testified to the existence of sophisticated political organizations and advanced technological capabilities, but they could not speak directly about the individuals who had created and led these societies. Modern scholarship has attempted to pierce this veil of mystery by subjecting the available sources to rigorous critical analysis and by incorporating new archaeological discoveries as they become available. However, many fundamental questions about Himiko's life and reign remain unanswered and may always remain so. Where exactly was her capital located? The Chinese sources provide directions that seem clear enough, but that have proven impossible to reconcile with the actual geography of Japan. Dozens of theories have been proposed, each supported by plausible evidence, but none conclusively proven. What was the actual extent of her political authority? The Chinese characterized her as the ruler of all Japan, but this may have reflected their tendency to simplify complex political relationships that they did not fully understand. Modern scholars debate whether she was truly a supreme ruler, or merely the most prominent among several competing political leaders. How should her shamanic practices be understood? The Chinese sources emphasize her role as a religious figure, but they may have misinterpreted political activities that they viewed through the lens of their own cultural assumptions. The relationship between religious and political authority in ancient Japan may have been quite different from what the Chinese sources suggest. Despite the mysteries that surround her historical existence, Himiko's influence on Japanese culture has proved remarkably durable. Each generation has rediscovered her story and found in it elements that speak to contemporary concerns and aspirations. This process of rediscovery and reinterpretation has ensured that her legacy remains alive and relevant even as the specific details of her life become increasingly obscure. During the medieval period, when Japan was dominated by warrior culture and military values, Himiko's story provided an alternative model of leadership that appealed to those who sought different approaches to political authority. Buddhist and Shinto religious traditions found in her example validation for the spiritual dimensions of governance and for the important role that women could play in religious life. The early modern period saw renewed interest in her story as scholars attempted to reconstruct the earliest phases of Japanese history and to understand the origins of distinctive Japanese cultural traditions. The growing awareness of Chinese historical sources that mentioned Himiko provided new opportunities for scholarly research, even as it also raised new questions about how these sources should be interpreted. The modern period has brought both new methods of historical investigation and new reasons for interest in Himiko's story. Archaeological techniques that were unknown to earlier generations of historians have provided detailed information about the material culture of her period, allowing for more sophisticated reconstructions of the society over which she ruled. At the same time, contemporary concerns about gender equality and female leadership have given new relevance to her example as a powerful woman who wielded supreme political authority in an era when such leadership was extremely rare. Modern feminists have found in her story both inspiration and validation for arguments about women's capacity for political leadership. Popular culture has also embraced Himiko's story, transforming her into a figure who appears in novels, manga, video games, and other forms of entertainment. These popular representations often take considerable liberties with the historical record, but they also serve to keep her memory alive in the public consciousness and to introduce new generations to her story. The archaeological search for her tomb and capital continues to generate public interest and scientific investigation. Each new discovery that might be connected to her reign becomes the subject of intense scholarly debate and media attention, reflecting the enduring fascination that her story holds for both specialists and the general public. Educational institutions have found in her story a useful vehicle for teaching about early Japanese history and about the complexities of interpreting historical sources. The fact that so much about her remains mysterious makes her an ideal subject for discussions about how historians work and about the limitations of historical knowledge. International scholarship has also contributed to the ongoing reinterpretation of her story. Chinese, Korean, and Western historians have brought their own perspectives to bear on the available sources, sometimes challenging assumptions that had been taken for granted by Japanese scholars, and sometimes providing new insights based on comparative analysis with other historical cases. As we reach the end of this long journey through the life and legacy of Queen Himiko, it becomes clear that her story is not simply about one remarkable individual who lived and died in ancient Japan. It is about the enduring human search for forms of leadership that transcend the crude exercise of force and that draw instead on deeper wells of wisdom and spiritual insight. The questions that her reign raised about the relationship between religious and political authority, about the role of women in governance, and about the possibilities for peaceful confederation among diverse communities remain as relevant today as they were 17 centuries ago. In our own era of political polarization and cultural conflict, there is something both inspiring and instructive about the example of a leader who built unity through spiritual charisma rather than military conquest. The mystery that surrounds her historical existence has, paradoxically, enhanced rather than diminished her significance. Because so much about her remains unknown, each generation is free to discover in her story the elements that speak most directly to its own concerns and aspirations. She becomes not simply a historical figure frozen in the past, but a continuing presence that can speak to the challenges and opportunities of the present moment. The archaeological evidence that continues to emerge from the Yayoi and Kofun periods provides tantalizing glimpses of the world over which she ruled. The bronze mirrors and iron tools, the elaborate pottery and sophisticated agricultural systems, the massive earthworks and carefully planned settlements all testify to a civilization of remarkable complexity and achievement. Yet, these material remains cannot capture the spiritual dimensions that seem to have been central to her reign. Perhaps this is as it should be. The deepest aspects of human experience, the moments of genuine insight, the bonds of trust and loyalty that hold communities together, the sudden illuminations that transform individual consciousness and collective understanding, these cannot be preserved in bronze or stone. They live instead in the stories we tell about them, in the inspiration they provide to later generations, and in the ongoing human commitment to the values they represent. Himiko's tomb, wherever it may be located, undoubtedly contains treasures that would illuminate many aspects of her reign and her society. But her true treasure lies not in any material repository, but in the continuing influence of her example. Each time someone chooses persuasion over force, spiritual insight over mere pragmatism, or inclusive leadership over authoritarian control, something of her legacy lives again. The great burial mound that was constructed to house her remains was intended to endure for all time, and archaeological evidence suggests that it has indeed survived the centuries with remarkable integrity. But even if earthquake or erosion should eventually claim this physical monument, the spiritual architecture that she built, the demonstration that authority could flow from wisdom rather than power, that unity could be achieved through respect for diversity, that leadership could be a form of service rather than domination. This architecture is proof against all the forces that destroy mere material structures. In the end, the story of Queen Himiko returns us to fundamental questions about what we value in leadership and what we hope to achieve through political organization. Her reign occurred at a moment of transition, when the simple social structures of the Neolithic period were giving way to the complex hierarchies that would characterize historical civilizations. The choices made during such transitional moments often echo through centuries of subsequent development. The choice that Himiko represented, to build authority on spiritual foundation rather than military might, to seek unity through confederation rather than conquest, to trust in the power of wisdom to transcend the limitations of force. This choice remains available to every generation. The specific forms that such leadership takes will vary with historical circumstances, but the underlying principles that guided her reign speak to universal human aspirations for justice, peace, and meaning. As the evening mists rise from the ancient valleys where her people once lived and worked, as the moon traces its eternal path across skies that once looked down upon her fortress, as the seasons turn with the same rhythm that marked the years of her reign, something of her presence continues to move through the landscape she once governed, not as a ghost haunting familiar places, but as a living inspiration that reminds each generation of the heights that human leadership can reach when it is guided by wisdom rather than mere ambition. The silence that now surrounds her tomb is not the silence of death, but the silence of deep listening. The kind of attentive stillness that was always at the heart of her shamanic practice. In that silence, those who seek wisdom can still hear the echoes of her voice, offering guidance for the eternal human task of building communities worthy of our highest aspirations. Her story ends, but her example continues, a light that burns on through the long night of history, showing the way toward forms of leadership that honor both the practical necessities of governance and the spiritual dimensions of human existence. And in the deepest silence of night, when the boundary between past and present grows thin, when the spirits of the ancestors draw close to offer their counsel to the living, something of Himiko's presence can still be felt, not as a relic of a distant past, but as a continuing invitation to discover within ourselves the wisdom and courage necessary to build the kind of world she envisioned. Her reign may have ended, but her revolution continues, carried forward by all who choose the path of wisdom over the way of force, who seek to lead through service rather than domination, and who trust in the power of the human spirit to transcend the limitations that history attempts to impose upon our highest hopes. The wind moves through empty valleys, where once her voice held sway, carrying still the whisper of possibilities that will not be silenced. In the turning of seasons, In the rising of morning mist, in the patient rhythm of waves against ancient shores, her presence endures, not as memory, but as promise. For wisdom, once awakened, never truly sleeps. And the spark she kindled burns yet in hearts that dare to dream of leadership guided by light rather than shadow, of power that serves rather than dominates, of authority that flows from the depths of understanding rather than the shallows of force. The story ends, but the song continues, sung by voices not yet born, in languages not yet spoken, carrying forward the eternal hope that somewhere, in some time yet to come, another will arise to show that the path of wisdom remains open, waiting for those brave enough to walk where she once walked, in the luminous space between earth and heaven where true leaders dwell.